Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax too, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. The Footsteps in the Silent Room. I moved into apartment 307 on a late autumn morning in Portland, Oregon. It was drizzling, the wind was chilly, and the air carried the musty scent of decaying leaves mixed with the distant sound of honking cars. The apartment was in an old building called Willow Heights, built in the 1950s with red brick architecture, narrow hallways, and an elevator that was constantly malfunctioning. I chose this place because the rent was surprisingly cheap, half the average price, and the landlord seemed eager to rent it out quickly. Looking back, I should have asked myself why. The room I rented was on the third floor, at the end of the hallway, opposite apartment 308. A door that was locked tight with no signs of anyone living there. I asked the manager, an old white man named Hank, about that apartment, but he just mumbled and quickly changed the subject. "No one's rented it for years," he said quickly, not making eye contact. "Some technical issues, plumbing or something." At the time, I didn't think much of it. The first night passed quietly. I was still unpacking my things, organizing books, and reassembling my bed. However, around 2 a.m., when everything around me was silent, I heard it. The footsteps, not from the ceiling or the hallway, but from the apartment across the hall. 308. Clearly, coldly, one step at a time. Slowly, as though someone was pacing back and forth in that small space. Each time the old wooden floor creaked, my back went cold. I got out of bed and stared through the peephole. The door to apartment 308 was still firmly shut. No lights, no movement. I pressed my ear to the door to listen more closely. Silence. I reassured myself that I was just tired, imagining things. Maybe it was the pipes expanding, or a large rat. But as I returned to my bed, the footsteps resumed. This time stopping right against the shared wall between the two apartments. I couldn't sleep the entire night. The following nights, things got stranger. The footsteps didn't just appear regularly at 2 a.m., but began moving throughout the apartment, as if the person, if they existed, was searching for something. There was even a time when I heard breathing, wheezing, heavy and interrupted. I started asking the neighbors. The woman living downstairs, Maria, a single mother of Mexican descent, seemed reluctant when I mentioned apartment 308. "Someone used to live there," she said, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. "A guy named Eric. He was kind, quiet, and would invite friends over on weekends. But then one night, no one saw him anymore. The police came with yellow tape, but no one knew what happened. After that, his best friend disappeared too. Since then, the apartment's been locked. I tried searching for information about Eric, but found nothing specific. No articles, no death records, and no one in the building remembered his full name. It was as if everything had been intentionally erased. I began having nightmares. In the dreams, I found myself standing in a pitch-black room, very similar to apartment 308, with bloodstains stretching across the wooden floor and whispers echoing in my head. He betrayed me. I won't leave. Never. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, I decided to try opening the door to the apartment across the hall. I dialed the manager Hank's number, but the line was busy. A strange, irresistible feeling, like being guided by someone, led me to the stairs, down the hall to the ground floor, to the manager's key box. And strangely, the key to apartment 308 was right at the top. It seemed to be waiting for me. I opened the door to 308 at exactly 2:12 a.m. The room was so cold that my breath turned to white vapor. Everything was covered in dust, but there were no signs of broken items or long-term abandonment. On the wooden table near the window, I saw a picture frame turned upside down. When I picked it up, my hand trembled. In the photo were two young men smiling brightly in a sunflower field. One of them was Eric. I recognized him from the photo Maria showed me. The other, it was Hank, the manager of the building. Just then, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding. On the large mirror at the end of the room, misty steam formed the words, "He killed me. Look under the floor." I stood frozen for a few seconds, then looked down at the floor. The wooden planks were uneven. One small corner was slightly scratched, as if someone had tried to pry it open. I bent down, using a small knife from my pocket to pry at the plank. Underneath was a broken layer of concrete and something wrapped in an old blanket. I didn't dare open it, but I could feel the faint smell of decay escaping, along with the strong metallic stench of old blood. I ran out of there, my hands covered in dust and my heart pounding like it would burst. The next morning, I called the police, anonymously. They arrived, surrounded the building, and took Hank away, as the neighbors whispered in panic. It seemed like it was all over. But that night, at exactly 2 a.m., the footsteps started again from apartment 308. Slowly, relentlessly, as if the soul wasn't ready to leave yet. "I still haven't found what I need." The whisper echoed through the walls, creeping into my sleep like a cold blade. I knew this was just the beginning. I once thought that Hank's arrest would be the end of everything, that the truth had been revealed, the culprit exposed, and that the spirit would find peace. But I was wrong. What happened afterward went far beyond the fear I had imagined. That night, as I tried to force myself to sleep after the police investigation, I had a strange dream. I was standing in the hallway of Willow Heights. Everything around me was bathed in a grayish hue. There were no lights, no voices, only the heavy, suffocating silence. I walked slowly, my feet pressing against the cold tile floor, heading toward apartment 308. The door was no longer locked. It was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I stepped inside, and everything changed. The room was filled with blinding light, but what made me step back wasn't the light, but the smell of blood. It was a pungent, suffocating odor, as if someone had been killed just moments ago. In the middle of the floor was Eric, his body twisted, his face covered in blood, and his mouth wide open, as though trying to say something. But no sound came. He reached out toward me, his lips moving. I'm still here, in the walls. I woke up with a start, cold sweat soaking through my shirt. The clock read 2:03 a.m. The footsteps echoed again from the room across the hall. The next morning, I went to the police station to inquire about the case. The officer on duty, a black woman named Sarah Monroe, seemed surprised when I mentioned Hank. "We've searched apartment 308, she said. "We found some human bone fragments, but we haven't been able to identify them yet." Hank is being held, but he denies all the charges. Says he was just visiting an old friend. No clear evidence. I tried to tell her about the dreams, the noises. Sarah just nodded as if to humor me, then handed me her business card. If anything strange happens again, call me. I left the station with a sense of emptiness. 3 nights later, everything started to feel wrong. At 1:48 a.m., I was awakened by knocking. Not footsteps, but loud, deliberate knocking coming from the shared wall between my apartment and 308. 3 knocks, pause, then 3 more, like Morse code. I opened my phone and looked up the symbols. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, SOS. I stood frozen. A chill ran down my spine. I tried knocking back. 1 dot, 1 dot, 1 dot. Silence. Then, a little while later, a faint voice echoed from within the wall, like a whisper, coming from the other side of reality. He's still here, in the dark. I started noticing small changes in my apartment. The kitchen cabinet wasn't shut as tightly as before, even though I clearly remembered closing it. The bathroom mirror had small handprints on it, as if from a child. Once, I saw a shadow dart across the doorframe while looking in the mirror. But when I turned around, no one was there. I decided to install a small surveillance camera in the living room, connected to my phone. That night, I dimmed the lights, lay still, pretending to sleep. 2:16 a.m. The camera detected movement. I opened my phone to watch the live stream, and I saw the door to apartment 308 slowly creaking open, even though I was certain the police had sealed it. A tall, thin figure stepped out, but the face was unclear. He stood silently in front of my door, motionless, just staring. Then he vanished, without turning, without walking, just dissolving into the air. I took the clip to Officer Sarah Monroe. She watched it, her face paling. We locked the door with a steel chain. She said no one could have gotten in. The building's surveillance system didn't record any movement on the 3rd floor that night. So, you think I'm imagining this? I said, my voice louder than necessary. Sarah hesitated, then quietly placed a file on the table. There's something we didn't tell you, she began. Eric didn't just live in 308. He was the one who discovered Hank's strange behaviors. We suspect Hank is involved in a series of disappearances from nearly 10 years ago. All young people living alone, renting in this area. I swallowed hard. You could be next if you don't leave. But I didn't leave because I felt like I had to stay, not just to uncover what really happened, but because I felt like I was bound to this place, like Eric, or whatever remained of him, was waiting for me, wanting me to see everything. One night, I stayed awake until morning, sitting on the floor, facing the wall of 308. I listened. No footsteps, no knocking. Only whispers, like wind passing through the door crack. He didn't kill me because I betrayed him, but because I knew his secret. A week later, I received an anonymous package. No sender's name, just a shaky note. If you want to know the truth, go to the basement. Willow Heights had a basement that residents weren't allowed to enter, where the old pipes, generator, and water system of the building were kept. I'd heard stories of people who went down there and never came back. That night, I brought a flashlight and opened the basement door. No footsteps, no knocking, only the smell of mildew and flickering yellow light. I descended the old wooden stairs, and everything started to get colder. In the basement, I discovered a small room. its wooden door sealed with a rusty sign, "Do not enter. Danger of death." I opened the door. Inside were images that left me speechless. Dozens of black and white photographs hanging on the walls. Missing persons, including Eric. Beneath them were small wooden boxes containing personal belongings. Watches, notebooks, bracelets, and Hank's journal. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and began reading the scrawled words. They all hear the footsteps. They all came looking for me. But no one understands. It's the house itself that keeps them here. Willow Heights isn't where I kill. It's where they make me do it. I stood in the basement, my heart racing. Above me, the footsteps echoed again, but not from the third floor, but from directly above the basement ceiling. A whisper came down. "If you don't leave, you'll be next." And then all the lights went out. No more light. Only breathing and footsteps coming closer to me. I don't remember how I ran out of the basement. The memories after the lights went out felt like a delirium. All that remained were the cold, rapid breaths and the shifting dark shadows around me. When I regained my senses, I found myself sprawled in front of apartment 307, my clothes covered in dirt, with Hank's old diary still in my pocket. But the scariest part wasn't what happened in the basement. It was when I saw the door to apartment 308 slightly ajar. There were no signs of forced entry, no sounds, just a dark gap, as if it was waiting for me to step inside once again. I didn't go in, not that night. I just stood there, staring for what felt like an eternity, clutching the diary as if it was a talisman. Then I quietly shut the door, locked it tight, and sat in the living room with all the lights on, as if the light could stop something from crawling out of the dark. The next morning, I took Hank's diary to the police station, hoping I could use it as evidence. But when I handed it to Officer Sarah Monroe, what she said sent chills down my spine. "It can't be." She flipped through the pages, frowning. "We searched the basement thoroughly. There's no hidden room down there. And..." She paused. "Hank. He died the night before last, in the holding cell." I froze. Died? Choked. No signs of trauma. It's like something pushed the air out of his lungs. I sat still. A chilling thought rose within me. Willow Heights no longer needed Hank. After his death, the building became strange. My downstairs neighbor, Maria, said she heard knocks on the door at 3 a.m. Steady every night. But when she opened it, no one was there. The children in the neighborhood started to be afraid, refusing to sleep alone because of the man in the gray coat who watches through the window. I began to lose sleep. No matter how many pills I took, I would wake up in the middle of the night to familiar sounds. Footsteps from apartment 308, knocking on the walls, and sometimes a strange screech like something dragging across the wooden floor. I went back to read the diary, searching for clues. There was a section near the end, the handwriting more frantic than usual. I can't control it anymore. They whisper from within the walls, calling my name. Willow Heights doesn't just contain bodies. It holds their souls. Souls trapped, just under the tiles, waiting for someone to open the way. The name Willow Heights began to haunt me. I searched for the history of the building, scouring online archives, and found a peculiar detail. Before it was an apartment complex, the land was home to a small psychiatric hospital called Westfield Sanitarium, operating from the 1930s until 1954. The hospital was shut down after a series of unexplained deaths. Patients disappeared in the night, nurses went mad, and a fire that was never explained. No one knows exactly how many people died. Afterward, the building was demolished and rebuilt into Willow Heights, right on the old foundation, right over the unhealed wound of the past. I decided to go back to the basement. This time, I brought a camera, a strong flashlight, and an old building blueprint I found in the archives. On the blueprint, a section was crossed out, an area marked as no access, located just beneath the row of apartments from 305 to 308. I realized it was the place I had entered that night, but when I descended into the basement, the hidden room was gone. Only an empty wall remained. I stood there, stunned, when the flashlight began to flicker. Then, on the cold cement floor, a voice echoed in my head, unclear if it was real or a hallucination. No need to search. They're already coming for you. Back in my apartment, I decided to leave. I packed my things in the dead of night, stuffing everything into a suitcase, not caring about checking out or the rental contract. But when I opened the door to leave, I saw Eric standing in the hallway. He was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his skin a pale gray as if he had never seen the sunlight. I instinctively stepped back, but he didn't approach. He just raised his hand and pointed to apartment 308. I shook my head, whispering, "I don't want to know anymore." But he kept staring at me and spoke in a raspy voice. "If you don't go back, they won't leave you alone." I didn't leave that night. I locked the door, went back to my room, and sat in the dark. I turned on the surveillance camera, aiming it at the 308 door. 2:13 a.m. The door opened again. But this time, 3, 4, 5 figures stepped out. Their faces unclear. No sound of footsteps. They just stood there, in front of my apartment door, then vanished like smoke. When I turned on the lights, the door was closed. But on the living room wall, a scrawled message appeared in something dark, like blood. The last living person will also become the one kept. Now I understand. Eric wasn't the only soul trapped. Willow Heights is a trap. A prison for souls betrayed, deceived, or murdered by those they trusted. I'm living in a graveyard standing upright. And the scariest part is, I've started hearing footsteps inside my own apartment. No longer from 308, but from my bedroom. I won't sleep tonight. I'm not sure I can leave here the normal way. If you're reading this, if the diary, the video camera, or anything I've left behind is found, burn this building down. Don't try to save me. Don't try to understand. Because once you hear those footsteps, it means you've been marked. I once thought that the worst nightmare was living next to a haunted room. But that was just the surface layer. The real nightmare is when you can no longer tell the difference between dreams and reality. When every sound in the night is not just a noise, it's a sign. When dreams start to follow one another like chapters of a story, pulling you into an abyss from which you can't escape, no matter how much you scream or struggle. That's what has been happening to me since the third night after I decided to stay. I began having recurring dreams. I always find myself standing in the hallway of the third floor of Willow Heights. All the doors are shut except for apartment 308. The door is always ajar, as if waiting for me to enter. I can't resist. Though my whole body is shaking, I still step inside, drawn in as if an invisible force is pulling me. The room inside never changes. It's always dark, always cold, always something lurking in the shadows, watching me. And I never wake up in the usual way. Each time I jolt awake, I find myself lying on the floor, mouth agape, throat dry, as if I had just been strangled. Once, I woke up and discovered my feet, covered in dirt. I remember clearly, before sleeping, I had locked the door. I had locked myself in the bedroom, even blocking the window with the bookshelf. I couldn't dare to sleep anymore. I set my alarm for every 30 minutes, drank coffee constantly, used every light in the house to stay awake. But eventually, even that reached its limit. The human body can't withstand more than 3 nights of sleeplessness. And on the 4th night, I fell asleep. While sitting, this dream wasn't like the others. I found myself sitting in a room full of mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different image. There's me sleeping, me crying, me being dragged across the floor by something. I tried to run, but my feet felt stuck to the cold tiled floor. One mirror at the end of the hallway cracked. From within, Eric stepped out. He walked toward me, his face blurred as if burnt, his voice distorted. "You're the last one. You have to open the door. Open the door for us." I jumped up drenched in sweat and found my hand resting on the doorknob of apartment 308. I didn't open the door. I backed away trembling, staring at my hand, covered in dust and dried blood. I returned to my apartment, locked 3 doors, and sat in the living room all night, holding my head, trying not to go insane. But nothing stopped. Objects in the apartment began moving. The chair automatically turned toward the wall. The window opened wide even though it had been locked tight. The lights flickered even though there was no power outage. Once, I heard water running, and when I stepped into the bathroom, I saw the bathtub full of black water in which a pale hand was rising. I couldn't live like this anymore. I decided to leave Willow Heights. I packed my things in the middle of the day, the only time I felt the building wasn't watching me. I planned to leave here and go far away, maybe to another state if needed, just never to return. But when I grabbed my suitcase, stepped into the hallway, and pressed the elevator button, the 3rd floor light flickered continuously. The door didn't open. The elevator didn't work. I ran down the stairs. The emergency exit door was welded shut with new metal, as if someone or something didn't want me to leave. I returned to my apartment, tried calling for help. There was no signal. The Wi-Fi was cut off. The landline no longer made any sound. I felt completely cut off from the outside world. That night, I woke, not because of the footsteps, but because of the laughter. A high-pitched, repeating laugh, unclear whether it was a man or a woman. It came from beneath the living room floor. I lay still, ears straining, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then the floor creaked. Each wooden plank rippled, as if someone was crawling underneath. I stood up and turned on the light. In the faint light, I saw a face appear through the gap between 2 planks. A pale face, eyes wide open, mouth twisted into a grin that stretched from ear to ear. Finally, someone's listening. I don't know how much longer I can endure. I started writing in a journal every day, noting each phenomenon. I set up cameras everywhere. The living room, the hallway, even the bathroom. But the videos I recorded weren't like what I saw with my own eyes. In the video, there were scenes of me standing in front of apartment 308, unlocking the door and walking in, even though I don't remember doing that. There were scenes of me talking to someone who wasn't there in the bedroom. Scenes of me turning on the stove in the middle of the night, placing a leather notebook into a pot of boiling water. I don't remember any of it. And what scared me the most was the last part of the footage. I was staring directly into the camera, smiling, just like the laugh I had heard from beneath the floor. I no longer know who I am. I don't know if I'm still sane, but I know one thing for sure. I can't leave Willow Heights. It's keeping me here, just like it kept Eric and the ones before him. Maybe I'll be erased from the world outside. My name won't be in any records. No one will remember I ever lived here. I'll be a part of the footsteps in that silent room. And one day, the door to 308 will open again, to wait for the next person. Story 2, The Trapped Soul and the Mystery. Behind the haunted door, I moved into this small house in the outskirts of Portland on a grey, rainy afternoon. The wind howled through the tall pines outside, and dry leaves swirled around the doorstep as I fumbled with the front door's lock. The house was listed online at an unbelievably low rent, half the price of small apartments in the city. I had been going through a tough time after my divorce, so when I saw the listing, I called right away. The landlord was an old man with silver hair named Richard Crowley. He seemed kind enough, his light blue eyes always lowered as if hiding something. During our first meeting, he showed me around the house: living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. But there was one door at the end of the ground floor hallway that he absolutely didn't mention. I had to ask before he hesitated and replied, "It's just a storage room. Locked. I lost the key a long time ago." I didn't ask any further. It didn't seem important. At that moment, I thought, who cares about a storage room? Everything started on the 3rd night I stayed there. I woke up at 2:17 a.m. Exactly at that time, neither early nor late, because I heard a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just a knock. 3 steady beats. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, listening intently. The house was as silent as a tomb. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around the room. Nothing unusual. But the knock? I was sure it came from somewhere downstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly crept downstairs. The old wooden floor creaked under my feet. When I reached the hallway, my heart tightened as I realized the knocking was coming from behind the locked door. Knock, knock, knock. I stood there, frozen. Not out of fear. Not at least I thought so at the time. But because my mind was trying to make sense of the absurdity in front of me. There's no one in there, right? The room's locked, and there's no other way out. I stepped closer, pressing my ear against the door. No sound. I tried the doorknob. It was tightly locked. As I turned to leave, I heard a whisper was faintly behind me. "Open the door." I spun around. No one. The next day I called Mr. Crowley, pretending to ask again about the room. "I told you," he replied quickly, his tone impatient. "It's just a storage room. I've locked it for years. Don't bother with it." "But last night I heard a sound." "Listen," he interrupted, his voice suddenly deep and serious. "If you want to stay, don't try to open that door. It isn't meant for anyone." I should have left right then. But instead of fear, I felt intrigued. It was as if that door was daring me. I began to search, trying every way to unlock it. I hired a locksmith under the excuse of losing my office room's key. The locksmith's name was Lucas, a young guy with tattoos running down his wrists. When he looked at the lock, his face suddenly became serious. "This lock, it's not like any usual residential type," he said. "This is a lock used in old insane asylums." "Where did you find this house?" I chuckled. "Craigslist." Lucas shook his head and bent down to work on the lock. It took nearly 20 minutes, but finally, there was a click. The door creaked open, revealing a dark gap. A rush of cold air poured out, carrying the smell of mildew and something else, like dried blood mixed with the faint scent of burnt ashes. "I don't think you should go in," Lucas whispered. I nodded. "I'll just take a quick look and lock it back." He left immediately. I stood before the slightly open door, hesitated for a long moment, then pushed it open. Inside was a small room, about 4 square meters. The walls were yellowed with large patches of peeling paint. On the floor was an old mattress, emitting a foul stench. But what sent a chill down my spine were the handprints smeared on the walls, dark red and blotchy, like someone had tried to crawl up, grab hold, scream for help. But no one came. In the corner of the room was a broken mirror. The only remaining piece was a large shard, reflecting a blurred image of the room. When I looked into it, my heart nearly stopped. In the mirror, there was a figure standing behind me. I turned around. No one. I left the room in a panic and locked the door tightly as soon as I stepped out. But from that night on, things got worse. I began to dream the same nightmare. I was trapped in that room, unable to scream, unable to breathe. A tall, shadowy figure with a featureless face would always approach me every time I closed my eyes. Each morning, I woke up with strange bruises on my body, like someone had gripped my shoulders tightly while I was asleep. The climax came on the 7th night. I woke up because I heard laughter faint, high-pitched like the sound of a woman, but there was no one in the house. I followed the sound downstairs and saw that the door was wide open. On the wall, someone had written in blood, "Thank you for opening the door. Now, it's your turn." I don't remember how I made my way back to the bedroom that night. The door at the ground floor, though closed, remained etched in my mind like a knife carving into flesh. The words written in blood. It couldn't be imagination. I wasn't sleepwalking. I wasn't mentally unstable. I was wide awake. And because of that, I felt a chill down my spine even more. I spent the whole next day sitting in the living room, pulling the curtains, locking all exits, and drinking no less than 3 cups of black coffee. In the dim light filtering through the window, I could clearly see the faint but real fingerprints on the glass door from the inside. They weren't mine. I had never touched the glass with dusty palms like that. I checked the security camera, a simple setup I had installed just 3 days ago, which included a camera placed in the hallway outside that room. When I rewound the video from around 2 a.m., I saw myself leaving the bedroom, walking down the hallway. But then the image suddenly became blurry. A white static lasted for almost 45 seconds. When the image returned, the door was open, and I was standing motionless in front of it, like a lifeless corpse. I don't remember any of it. This couldn't be. That night, I did the most foolish thing a terrified person could do. I went back to that room. This time I was better prepared. I wore a recorder, turned on a high-powered flashlight, and brought salt water and a silver ring, just because I read online that this was the classic way to ward off evil. It was funny, but I had no other choice but to believe in the absurd. The door opened easier than I thought. No more smell of blood, no more chill. Just a silent room, drenched in darkness. I stepped inside, placed the recorder on the old mattress, and began to speak. "Is anyone here? I'm Tom. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to know, why is this room locked?" No answer. Only the sound of my own voice, faintly echoing from the stained walls. But as I was about to leave, I felt someone standing right behind me. A gentle breeze brushed my neck, cold enough to make my hair stand on end. I turned quickly. Still nothing. I hurriedly left the room, locked the door, and just as I stepped out, I heard a whisper, not in my ears, but in my head. "Stay. Don't leave me here again." The recorder had captured an unfamiliar sound I didn't hear while I was there. When I asked, "Why is this room locked?" in the silence that followed, there was a distinct, very clear sigh, very close to the microphone. And then a woman's voice, almost a whisper, light but unmistakable. "He locked me in. He thought I wouldn't remember." I decided to learn more about the house. I went to the city archives, went through the building records, owner information, anything that could help me understand the strange things happening. I found a name, Eleanor Watts. In 1998, Eleanor, a high school music teacher, disappeared in this very house. She'd rented the house for a few months when she suddenly vanished without a trace. No body, no clues. The police investigated, but the case went cold. The landlord at the time? None other than Richard Crowley. In the investigation report from that year, there was a small note from the sheriff. The victim is suspected to have been unlawfully imprisoned in the house. However, no evidence of a confinement room or body was found. I went to see Crowley. No appointment. I couldn't wait any longer. He lived in a retirement home in the eastern suburbs. When I arrived, he was sitting in an armchair, gazing out the window, holding a small glass of liquor. "You know why I'm here?" I began. He said nothing. He only took a sip of his drink, then sighed. "She used to love me," he murmured. "Eleanor. But she wanted to leave. She said I was a pervert." I clenched my fist. "You killed her?" "No." He shook his head, his eyes welling with tears. "I just wanted to keep her. A little longer. But then she went mad. She smashed things, screamed, scratched the walls. I couldn't let the neighbors hear. I locked the door and never opened it again." "You locked her up until she died?" He nodded. A slow, heavy nod, as if his entire life collapsed at that moment. "I've heard her voice every night, for 20 years. She never forgave me. When I returned home, I found that everything had changed. All the pictures on the walls were turned around. The bathroom mirror was cracked, even though no one had touched it. But the most terrifying thing was, on the bedroom wall, written in something dark red like blood, were the scrawled words, "Don't forgive him. Keep him here. With me." I no longer felt just haunted. I felt like I was being pulled into an old curse, one that Eleanor, or whatever remained of her, was trying to complete. That night, I heard the sound of a piano coming from the locked room. It wasn't loud music. It was the sound of someone playing a sad, disjointed melody, like someone who once loved music but had forgotten how to feel joy. I sat under the stairs, trembling, gripping a fruit knife, as if a small blade could stop whatever was living in the darkness. I knew I couldn't go on living like this. Either I would go mad or I had to end this. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even dare to close my eyes. The sound of piano music came from the locked room, each note ringing out slowly, disconnected, as though someone was playing notes from a decayed memory. There was something in that sound that made my stomach twist. It wasn't fear, it was pain. A suffocating feeling spread from my chest, as if I was sharing sorrow with a soul no longer part of this world. I sat still until the first faint light passed through the living room window. A grey, bleak dawn. Even the sky seemed to refuse to color the new day. Everything was blurry in the mist, and I could no longer tell what was a dream and what was reality. I decided to meet Eleanor's daughter. In an old article I found at the city library, it mentioned that Eleanor had lived with a child a few years before she disappeared. The girl's name was Lena Watts, only 6 years old at the time. After the incident, Lena was adopted by her aunt and moved to another state. It took me nearly 2 days to trace the new address, and I called Lena, pretending to be someone reinvestigating her mother's case. I didn't dare say too much over the phone. Who would believe me? But to my surprise, she agreed to meet. Perhaps deep down, she carried an unease that had never been released. Lena now lived in Eugene, about a 3-hour drive from Portland. When I arrived, she was already sitting in a small corner cafe. Her dark brown hair tied back neatly, eyes sunken as if she hadn't slept well in years. I used to dream of my mom being locked up, she said as soon as I sat down. In the dream, she always knocked on a door. 3 knocks. Then she stopped, over and over. I swallowed. I hear those knocks every night, I confessed, from the very locked room where she used to live. Lena stared at me for a long moment before pulling out a small leather notebook from her bag. I've kept this since I was little. It's my mom's journal. They told me she disappeared, but I know she never left that house. I opened the notebook, each page yellowed, the ink fading over time. The handwriting, shaky, was clearly from a woman. Richard won't let me go outside anymore. He says the world out there isn't for me. Last night, I heard Lena's voice through the walls, but when I called, no one answered. I'm starting to forget her face. I'm afraid one day I won't remember it anymore. A few pages near the end were torn, as if someone had deliberately ripped out something they didn't want anyone to know. But I could imagine. Eleanor's final days must have been more than just suffocating. It was the unraveling from within. That night I returned home with a decision in my mind. I would free Eleanor, not just to help her, but to save myself. The longer I stayed, the more I felt the house was eating me alive, piece by piece. The shadowy figures passing by in mirrors, the unexplained bruises on my arms, the laughter echoing from the kitchen each night. All of it felt like silent daggers cutting into my nerves. I sought out someone who specialized in supernatural phenomena, a woman named Marrow, who had once been a pastor, but now performed spirit summoning for lost souls. She had been featured in a documentary about a haunted house in Kansas. So I thought, if anyone could help, it would be her. She arrived at dusk, wearing a black cloak and carrying a small silver bell. "This house, it's heavy," she whispered as she stepped inside. "The soul in here is not just one person. There's something else, like a wound that never heals." I led her into the room as soon as the door opened. The silver bell in her hand rang on its own, though no one shook it. "She's here," Maribel whispered, her eyes closed. "But she can't escape. There's a curse binding her soul to this room, and there's only one way to break it. You must confront her final memory, become the witness to her death. She needs someone to remember, someone who won't let the pain be forgotten." She spread a circle of salt around me, then placed the broken mirror I had seen in the room in front of me. She chanted in a strange, ancient tongue, and then I fell into nothingness. I found myself standing in the very same room, but it was completely different. The walls were still a bright cream color. The pillows smelled of lavender, and Elena, still alive, was sitting at the piano, playing Clair de Lune on the old instrument. But suddenly, the music stopped. The door swung open. Richard entered, younger, his eyes clouded with jealousy. "Who are you sending letters to?" he growled, tearing the envelope from Eleanor's hands. "What are you writing to that girl? You want to leave here?" Eleanor trembled. "Lena needs me. I can't stay here forever." Richard didn't say another word. He just closed the door and locked it from the outside. Eleanor rushed to the door, banging it, screaming, but all that echoed back was an empty sound. I watched the whole thing, like a silent ghost. And then she turned to look directly at me. "Don't let me be forgotten." I snapped back to reality. The room was now as cold as a tomb. Maribel stood beside me, trembling, holding the now broken silver bell in her hands. "She saw you," she whispered. "You're the last witness, and that might help her move on. But it could also pull you with her." When I left the house for the last time, I left a recording, Eleanor's notebook, and a letter to Lena, telling her everything. I couldn't stay there another night. But I knew one thing. I was no longer myself, because every night, no matter where I am, I still hear knock, knock, knock. I left the house on Elwood Street one sunless morning. The sky was gloomy, no rain, but the atmosphere was thick like a damp blanket draped over my neck. I didn't carry much, just a small suitcase, a notebook, and the tape recorder that had followed me throughout this crazy journey. The house stood cold and silent behind me, as lifeless as a part of my memory that I had tried to bury deep. I thought I had ended it all. I thought until the first night at the roadside motel, room 204, second floor. Nothing special. The walls covered in old patterned wallpaper. The smell of bleach mixed with the staleness of long accumulated mold, and the bed sagging in the middle, as if someone had just left moments ago. I lay awake until almost 3 a.m. when the knocking started. 3 knocks, short, even, clear. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. My blood seemed to turn to ice. I didn't jump up immediately, didn't rush to check like some fool in a horror movie. I just lay there, my eyes glued to the ceiling, my ears straining. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was closer. Not from the door, but from inside the wardrobe. I sat up, my heart pounding as if it would leap from my chest. I slowly approached, my hand trembling as it reached for the wardrobe handle. Each finger was freezing. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Nothing inside, just a torn piece of paper, folded into thirds, casually draped over a hanger. I picked it up and opened it. A scrawled line, Written in red ink read, "I don't want to go alone." The next morning, I returned to Portland. I met with Lena, recounting everything that had happened, from the motel to the paper in the wardrobe. She didn't seem surprised. On the contrary, Lena quietly turned to the last page of her mother's diary. It seemed I had missed something. "If anyone remembers me, I will find them. I don't want to disappear. I don't want to drift away in oblivion." Lena looked up. Maybe. My mother is no longer bound to that house, but she hasn't truly moved on. She's looking for someone to hold on to her memory. And now, she's chosen you. I shook my head, my voice choking. I can't live like this. I can't live every night waiting for a knock, waiting for a nightmare to materialize. "Then you have to help her finish it," Lena said firmly. "Not to set her free, but to let her accept her death." We returned to the house for the last time. I knew there was something still buried in that room, part of the truth, hidden not by time, but by Eleanor herself. The house was now sealed, as Crowley had died only 3 days after our last meeting. Cause of death: suffocation in his sleep, despite no signs of illness. But according to medical records, there was a bruise on his neck, round like a handprint. I didn't think it was a coincidence. We broke the lock and entered. The air in the room seemed thick and oppressive. The smell of metal mixed with mold and something sickeningly sweet. Lena stood next to me, holding her mother's necklace. The only thing she had kept all these years. "We need to find where my mother died," she said. I looked around. The walls still bore the scratches of handprints. The mirror was broken. The mattress was damp with mold. But there was one thing I hadn't noticed before. A tile in the corner of the room was slightly raised. I knelt down, carefully prying it loose. A hollow wall was revealed, small, but deep enough to hold an old metal box. I opened it. Inside was a human hand bone, still partially covered in skin. A silver necklace, identical to the one Lena was holding, and a faded piece of paper with only one line written. I cried until my tears ran dry. But no one came. As soon as I finished reading, the room's light went out. The wind howled through the walls, and a fragmented voice echoed, as if coming from the wall itself. "Child. Lena. Is that you?" Lena froze. "Mom? It's me." No response, only a soft sobbing sound like mist. I saw the handprints begin to appear on the walls, but this time they weren't blood. They shimmered faint like mist, touching the necklace Lena wore. Then the voice came again, weaker. "Do you still remember me?" Lena cried. "I've never forgotten you. Never." In that moment, the room lit up gently, like moonlight. And for the first time, I saw Eleanor, no longer the shadowy figure haunting the mirror, but a thin woman with dark circles under her eyes, tangled hair, yet her gaze was soft, like the deep sea. She looked at Lena, looked at me, then nodded. "Thank you." Eleanor disappeared in the soft white light, taking with her the bloodstains, the decaying smell, and the sound of a broken piano. The room returned to its original emptiness. Only Lena remained, choking back tears, clutching the necklace tightly. I knew it was truly over, or I thought so. 3 weeks later, I moved to a small apartment, far from Portland. Life slowly returned to normal, if you could call it that. I could sleep again. I could eat again. I no longer heard knocks. I no longer dreamed of Eleanor. Until the night of my birthday, when I received an envelope with no return address, Inside was an old photograph. In the photo, Eleanor was holding a young Lena. Behind them, faintly, was the figure of a man, strikingly similar to me. And on the back of the photo, handwritten, were the words, "Not every door has only one soul behind it." Story 3. The Possessed Soul. I moved into apartment 3B on Hollow Ridge Street on an October afternoon, when the air began to chill and dry winds whispered through the quiet neighborhood like voices no one could hear. This apartment used to belong to my mother. She passed away 2 months ago from what was diagnosed as a sudden stroke. But nothing about her death ever truly sat right with me. Not because I suspected someone had killed her, but because something felt off. Like she had known something was going to happen, but couldn't stop it. I returned to Boston alone, bringing with me an old suitcase, a few family photos, and fragmented memories of my childhood spent in this very apartment with her. I intended to sell it, but something held me back. That very first night I dreamt of her. She was standing in the kitchen, the exact spot where she used to bake my favorite apple pies when I was a child. But in the dream, she had her back to me, silent. As I stepped closer, she slowly turned around, and I almost screamed. Her face was smudged as if someone had tried to erase the details from a painting. I woke up with chills running down my spine, heart pounding in my chest. The clock read 3:17 a.m. I walked into the living room, intending to get a glass of water, and that's when I noticed it. A wine-colored coat hanging on the door hook. I had never worn anything like that, and I was sure my mother hadn't either. The fabric was thick, and a faint smell of tobacco lingered at the collar. I looked around. The apartment was dead silent. No signs of a break-in, no open windows. I brushed it off, told myself it might have been hers, and I simply didn't remember. I hadn't really gone through all her things yet. The next morning, I opened the small closet at the end of the hallway, the one where my mother used to stash miscellaneous items. I froze. An old photo box. But not just pictures of my mother. There were people I'd never seen before. A blonde woman in a floral dress standing beside my mother. A boy with a purplish birthmark on his cheek. A man with round glasses smiling awkwardly at the camera. In every photo, my mother stood in the center, and her gaze was always directed just outside the frame, as if she were looking at something, or someone behind the person taking the picture. I picked up one, taken somewhere that looked like an old church, on the back, written in faded ink, for the replacements. My heart thudded. Replacements? 3 days later, I began to understand why my mother never let me enter the storage room at the end of the hall. I opened the door after hearing a strange scraping sound coming from inside at night, like metal dragging across tile. Inside was a small windowless room, completely dark. The floral wallpaper was peeling, and a wooden table with a broken leg stood in the middle. On the table was an oil painting. Someone had painted my mother's face. But in the painting, she wore a high-neck white dress, the style of the 1940s. Her eyes stared intensely at the viewer, and I had the eerie sense she was trying to say something, to warn me. I took the painting down. Behind it was a hollow space in the wall, a hidden recess. Inside, I found a small notebook, aged, the paper edges browned with time. The first page was written in a familiar hand. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't stop it. You have to leave, Lily. Don't let it choose you. I held my breath, flipped through a few pages, scattered notes about replacements, about some ancient ritual where the souls of the dead continue to live through the bodies of others. But only if that person is weak enough, lost enough, with no one left to hold on to. One section was underlined. They didn't kill me. I let them take me, so you could live. I stumbled back, hands trembling, my head buzzing. That evening, I got a phone call from an unknown number. A raspy female voice whispered close to my ear. "Where are you now, Lily? The next one has been chosen." I dropped the phone onto the floor. No one knew this number but my mother. And she was dead. I rushed to leave, but the front door was locked from the outside. There was no one in the hallway, but I heard slow, deliberate footsteps from the floor above. There were only 3 floors in this building. I was on the top one. I turned back. The wine-colored coat I'd thrown in the trash the day before. It was hanging on the door hook again, soaked, and dripping black water onto the floor. I don't know what I'm dealing with, but something tells me I don't have much time left. And my mother, though dead, seems to be trying to send me a message about a curse, about souls that are taken, and about a force that still continues to choose its replacements. And this time, it's my turn. I couldn't sleep after that night. It felt like something invisible was clinging to me, circling my tiny apartment like a shadow that would never disappear. I locked every door, closed every curtain, but every sound, every gust of wind outside the hallway made me jump, and the coat was still there, hanging silently, dripping thick, dark drops like blood onto the wooden floor. I didn't dare touch it again. The next morning, I decided to investigate the names in the notebook my mother left behind. In the final pages, she mentioned a woman named Elaine Garber. She had lived on the 2nd floor, apartment 2A, for over 10 years before vanishing without a trace. My mother wrote, "Elaine was the first to see the signs, but no one believed her. Now she's gone. I made my way down to the 2nd floor. Apartment 2A was sealed, its door buried under a thick layer of dust. But right next to it was 2B, its light still on. I knocked softly. A middle-aged woman opened the door. Her hair was thin and silver, her face gaunt, but her eyes were sharp, like they had seen things no one should ever see. "I'm Lily, daughter of Monica Monahan from 3B, I said, my voice slightly trembling. She stared at me for a moment, then gently opened the door wider. "Come in, but only for 10 minutes. Apartment 2B smelled of mildew and mint. On the coffee table were old photographs, some with burned edges. I recognized my mother in one of them, standing with a group of strangers, all wearing serious expressions, as if they had just participated in some strange ritual. "My name is Gladys," the woman began, her voice raspy. "I used to be your mother's friend, before everything went bad." "Bad?" I asked. "Have you ever heard of something called soul transference?" I shook my head, though the term stirred something unsettling inside me. Gladys sighed. "It's an ancient ritual, where those near death could relocate their souls into another body, usually someone young, isolated, and easy to control. A replacement." A chill ran down my spine. Every word she spoke pierced thoughts I had tried to suppress since my mother's death. "Your mother was part of a group studying this, alongside Elaine Garber, Harold Evans, and Thomas Lauren. They all lived in this building once. They believed they could stop the ritual, But then one by one, they disappeared, died, or worse. Worse, I asked, barely breathing. I decided to dig through my mother's old boxes again. There was one I hadn't touched, labeled Forbidden Rituals. Inside was a handwritten Latin ritual with my mother's note. Do not perform without 3 witnesses. Must draw your own blood. Must call the ghost's name in its own voice. There was also a cassette tape, so old it was nearly moldy. I found an old tape recorder in the closet. The tape hissed, then a woman's voice, choking, trembling, spoke. My daughter, if you're hearing this, don't turn around. Don't let it see you. It's still here, still hungry. I turned instinctively, and I saw a figure standing behind the living room curtain. No one was supposed to be in the apartment. I lived alone. No one else came in through the front door. I couldn't breathe. I stepped back, silently, carefully. But with every step I took, the figure behind the curtain mirrored me, step for step. As my back hit the door, the curtain was yanked open. No one was there. Just the wine-red coat, this time lying crumpled on the floor, its sleeves twisted and soaked in blood. I had no other choice. I had to uncover my mother's past, what she had done, what she had endured, and what she had been trying to hide. I called the last person in her notebook, Thomas Lauren, but the number was disconnected. I followed the old address she had written, a small house on the outskirts of Brookline. The door was ajar. Dust covered everything. And on the wall, a newly painted image, in thick, crude black strokes, depicted a woman with outstretched arms. Behind her, faceless figures closing in, step by step. Beneath it, written in dried blood, the last one wasn't your mother. You are the next. I don't know what I've awakened, but something is coming. And my mother, somehow, is still buying me time. From the other side of death. I returned to the apartment close to midnight, my mind still reeling with the image of the blood-stained painting in Thomas Lauren's house. The words, "The last one is not your mother. You are the next," kept repeating in my head like a curse. I didn't know why he painted that, or who left the message, but it was clear that what I was facing was far beyond a mere scare or a series of eerie coincidences. This was a real ritual, and I had inadvertently stepped right into its center. I didn't turn off the lights that night. Every shadow felt like something was waiting for me to walk into it. And then, I dreamed of my mother. In the dream, she stood in the kitchen, the same place I'd seen in my first dream. But this time, she turned around. My mother's face was normal, gentle, full of pain. "You have to find him, Lily," she said. "Thomas is still alive, but he's not whole." I asked, "Where is he?" My mother didn't answer. She simply turned and pointed toward the refrigerator. I jolted awake, sitting up with cold sweat dripping down my forehead. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked toward the kitchen, the dim yellow light casting a glow on the refrigerator door. Something slid out from under the fridge. I approached. It was a crumpled piece of paper, as if someone had tried to stuff it into a gap, and the wind had blown it out. The paper had an address for a nursing facility about an hour outside of Boston. The corner of the paper had the logo of a psychiatric hospital, but the name had been scratched out. At the bottom, someone had quickly written a note. "Don't go alone. I couldn't wait." The next morning, I left the apartment early, clutching the piece of paper like a fragile talisman. On the way, I called Gladys, the woman who lived downstairs, and after a long silence, she agreed to come with me. Thomas used to be a history teacher at the art school, Gladys said. Very smart, but he was also very trusting. When the ritual started spreading, he became obsessed with documenting everything. Perhaps he's the only one left who knows how to break it. We arrived at the nursing facility around noon, the sky gray and drizzling. The red brick building appeared, bare and desolate, behind a line of dry trees, cold and silent, like a forgotten part of the world. The nurse on duty led us to room 309 at the end of the third floor hallway. He doesn't talk to anyone, but he draws. A lot. The door opened with a heavy creak, and I saw Thomas Lauren, or rather, a shadow of the man who used to be called Thomas. He sat with his back turned, his hair a messy silver tangle, and on the walls were hundreds of scribbled drawings in pencil. Faceless figures, broken mirrors, and repeatedly, an image of a young girl in a white dress. Me. He turned around. His eyes were vacant, but when he saw me, he flinched as if shocked by an electric jolt. You came?" he whispered. "They've chosen you." I sat down facing him. "You knew my mother, Monica Monahan. I need to know what she did. And the ritual. I need to stop it." Thomas trembled. His dry, wrinkled hand clutched mine tightly. "We thought we could save them," he said. "Those souls, the ones who died unjustly, who were burned alive, executed, sacrificed. They don't want to leave. They need bodies, and the replacement ritual is the way they continue to live on." "And my mother, did she participate?" I asked. "She didn't just participate," he growled. "She sacrificed herself to buy time for you. She knew you were the next one chosen." I felt my legs go cold. Breaking the ritual isn't easy. It requires blood, your blood, and it must be done where the gate was first opened. St. Winifred's Church. Do you know it? I nodded. I'd seen that church in one of the old photos. The one with the inscription, "For the replacements." "And there's one more thing," Thomas continued. "You can't do it alone. Someone must oppose the ritual in the middle of the ceremony, or else you'll be swallowed whole." Gladys grabbed my hand. "I'll go with you." We left the facility as it was getting dark. I looked back at Thomas one last time, but he didn't look at me. His eyes were glued to the last drawing, an image of a woman being consumed by a mirror. That night, Gladys and I went to St. Winifred, an old church abandoned for over 3 decades. Hidden deep in the forest, the entrance was covered with fallen leaves and vines wrapped around the rusty iron gate. When we pushed the door open, the smell of mold, dead animals, and old ash hit us, as if trying to smother every breath. Inside, on the main altar, a large mirror was tilted, its surface cracked. On the floor, dried blood had formed a circle with strange symbols. I stepped into the center of the circle. I pricked my finger. Blood dripped onto the mirror. I began to recite the words from the ritual my mother had left me. The air grew colder. The wind howled from every direction. The walls of the church shook violently, and in the mirror, my mother's face appeared. "Stop," her voice echoed in my head. "You won't have a chance to escape." But I kept reading. Then the mirror shattered. From within it, a black shape lunged out. A distorted figure. A human face with no eyes. Its mouth full of spiky teeth. It charged toward me. Gladys screamed, "I oppose this ritual." That night, I went through everything my mother had left behind, searching for another clue. There was a small wooden box buried beneath old books under the bed. The lock was rusted. I had to use a screwdriver to pry it open. Inside was an old, untitled leather notebook. The cover was embossed with an image of a snake's eyes, strange and primitive. The first pages were written in my mother's handwriting, but it was not her usual neat script. This was hurried, scrawled, as if written in a delirium or panic. In the middle of the notebook, I found a family tree, a Marrow family lineage. That name made my skin crawl. Sarah Marrow. I had heard that name before, in some dream, and now it was right here, in the family tree, in the third generation of the bloodline. Right beneath her name was my mother's frantic note. The child burned alive. Her soul never finds peace. I spent the whole next day tracing that name. A former friend who worked at Boston University's library helped me dig through old records, and what I found chilled me to the bone. In 1883, in Bath, Maine, there was a massive fire that consumed the Marrow family farm. Among the victims was an 11-year-old girl named Sarah, locked in the horse stall and tied by her hands before the flames reached her. The incident was ruled an accident, but no one could explain why the girl was bound or why her father, Samuel Marrow, disappeared immediately afterward. There was no funeral, no body, just ashes and a singed white silk handkerchief embroidered with the letter S found beneath the burned earth. I contacted the Bath town office, and after several calls, I found a small wooden house on the edge of the woods, the Marrow family's ancestral home, now a dilapidated property. No one had moved in since 1979, after the last owner, my great-grandfather, committed suicide by nailing his mouth shut and starving himself to death. I knew I had to go there. Gladys wouldn't let me go alone. She said, if anyone knows how to banish the soul of a Marrow, it would be them. But they're also the ones who created the curse. We arrived in Bath early in the morning, the fog thick and the cold biting. The house emerged along a forest path, rotting wood, half-collapsed roof, and a front door hanging askew. Inside was a space frozen in time. Furniture covered in dust, cobwebs stretched like curtains. In the living room was a black stone fireplace, above which hung an oil portrait. A man with cold iron eyes and a smile that looked almost sickly. Samuel Marrow, Gladys whispered. He's Sarah's father. I stepped closer to the painting, and then the eyes in the painting moved. I jumped, but when I looked back, the eyes were still. I ascended to the second floor. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the hallway was a small room, locked tight. The door bore signs of having been battered from the inside, as if someone had been trapped and tried to escape. I broke the lock. The room was empty, but the floor was covered in burnt handprints, imprinted on the wood like charcoal. In the center was a small lace pillow and a leather-bound journal with singed edges. I opened it. Day 12. Father says I'm the chosen one. I don't understand. But Mother cried. She said Father is a liar. I'm scared. Day 15. They tied me. Father says it's the ritual to keep the soul. Mother screamed. Then they locked me in the horse stall. The last day, I hear the fire. I scream, but no one answers. I feel blood oozing from my hands because the ropes are too tight. I don't know if I'm dying or sleeping. The pen stopped in the middle of a sentence. The rest was burned. Gladys whispered behind me. The girl never found peace. Her soul is locked in the ritual. And because of betrayal, she seeks a replacement to continue existing. The marrow bloodline is the key to unlocking and sealing the ritual. I shuddered. Your mother, and now you, carry that blood. As we left the house, I felt something following me, as if the very air had become heavy, sticking to every strand of my hair, every crease of my coat. When we got back to the apartment, I realized something terrifying. The oil painting in the ancestral house, the portrait of Samuel Marrow, was now hanging on my wall. I had never brought it back, and in the bedroom mirror, I saw Sarah. She was standing right behind me. Her face was burned, the other half like wax melting away. Her mouth was wide open, but no sound came. I turned around. No one was there. When I looked at the mirror again, she was gone. But beneath the mirror's edge was a blood-written message. Your blood opens the door. Your blood will close it. I knew it was time to return to where the ritual began. And this time, I wasn't going to break it. I was going to end it all. For my mother, for Sarah, and for myself. I no longer dream, no nightmares, no strange dreams, nothing at all. Just an emptiness. It's as if something has been taken from my mind. A part of my memory, a piece of my soul. During the day, I still live, eat, breathe, but at night, I become hollow. The apartment seems to have absorbed part of who I am, and in its place is the presence of Sarah Marrow. Her shadow appears everywhere, in the mirror, on the fogged window glass, in the reflection on the TV screen when I turn it off. Never once have I seen Sarah's face clearly, but her burning, empty eyes, full of fury, are always watching me. Gladys told me I was marked. A mark no one could see, but Sarah knew it well. And at a certain point, the soul would no longer just observe. It would possess me. I returned to Sarah's charred journal. A scribbled line on the last page, which I hadn't noticed before, seemed hastily written. You can close the door with blood, but not the blood of the one who opens it. That sentence lingered in my mind for days. I didn't understand. I thought my own marrow blood was what had to be sacrificed to end the ritual. But now, the statement contradicted everything I knew. One night, I dreamed of my mother. She wasn't standing in the kitchen as before. This time, she sat beside my bed. Her face was gaunt, more hollow than ever. Her eyes were swollen, but still as gentle as they had been before. You're not the one to end this, she whispered. You are the one who will continue it. I suddenly asked, then who is the one to end it? My mother didn't answer. She only raised her hand and pointed at my chest. Then she vanished. The next morning, I received a package with no return address. Inside was an ancient piece of lace, its edges singed, embroidered with the letter S. I almost dropped it. The silk handkerchief was identical to the one found after the Marrow House fire in 1883. Someone had kept it, and now someone was sending it to me. Along with the handkerchief was an old black and white photo. A family of 3. The man was Samuel Marrow. Next to him was a strange woman, and in the center, a little girl. Sarah, TC 27. Вот хватит скиту. Gladys told me there was one place no one had ever mentioned. The old prayer vault beneath St. Winifred's Church. The site of the first ritual. It wasn't recorded in the files, but according to the stories passed down by the priests, it was where the Marrows set up their first altar, with Sarah as the leading spirit, the first to be sacrificed, and also the first to rebel. I knew I had to go there. The stairway down to the vault was a crumbling stone staircase behind the main altar. Gladys and I spent over an hour breaking through a wall sealed with cement from the 1960s. The air below was thick, heavy with the smell of sulfur, as if life had never touched this place. The flashlight beam revealed walls covered in dried blood markings and ancient runes. In the center was a circle drawn in black, unyielding blood, and a large mirror placed flat on the floor. No frame, no cracks. The surface of the mirror was smooth as water. As I stepped closer, the mirror began to reflect. Not me, but my mother when she was young, holding me as a child. Then the image blurred and Sarah appeared, standing quietly beside me, her empty eyes fixed on me. I stepped into the circle. Blood dripped from my palm, forming a pentagram at the center. I began reading the final entry in Sarah's journal. Even though it wasn't a ritual, it was the last thing she had left behind. Each word I spoke echoed like a scream. The air changed color. A whirlwind blew from nowhere. Faceless figures appeared around the circle. And Sarah stepped out of the mirror. She didn't rush at me. She didn't scream. She just stood there. I whispered, "I'm not the one to end this. Am I?" She nodded. Her lips torn open, parted to speak. Her voice, like hundreds of people speaking together. Only one who carries the bloodline, but is not born of the curse, has the right to end it. I didn't understand. Gladys took a step forward. "I don't carry the marrow bloodline, but I'm the one who has witnessed 3 generations destroyed by it." Then she stepped into the circle, cut her hand. Her blood fell into the center. The mirror began to tremble. The faceless figures screamed. Sarah knelt and began to fade. Everything went dark. I woke up hours later. Gladys lay in the center of the circle, lifeless, but the mirror was shattered, and Sarah was gone. For the first time in many nights, there was no voice echoing in my head. No image in the mirror, no white dress, no blood, only silence. I buried Gladys next to my mother. No relatives, no funeral, just me, a bouquet of white flowers, and a whispered promise in the wind. "Thank you. You're the one who ended it." But when I returned to my apartment, there was a letter on the table. No envelope, no name. Inside was only one sentence. "When one ritual ends, another begins." Story 4. A Warning from the Beyond. I never believed in haunted houses. I'm a practical person, even sometimes labeled as stubborn. But every belief, every ounce of logic, and all my confidence crumbled entirely last fall when my family moved to a small town in Vermont, USA. A place where the cold clings to your skin like claws, and the darkness is so thick it could swallow a sigh. We moved here after my husband, Jack, got a new job in construction, an opportunity too good to pass up. Jack, our 2 kids, Natalie, who was 10, and Lucas, who had just turned 6, and I packed up the old SUV and left the city full of hopes for a fresh start. We found an old Victorian-style house, tucked away from the main road, nestled between rows of maple and oak trees, shedding their leaves. The grey slate roof and tall arched windows had a somber, almost watchful quality, as though it had always quietly observed you from a distance. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Withers, sold the house at such a low price that it was suspicious. I remember asking her, "Are you sure there's nothing wrong with this house?" She only smiled vaguely, her gaze drifting past me, and whispered, "It just doesn't like being forgotten." I thought I had misheard her, but at that moment, I was too exhausted and eager for a new life to pay attention to her strange words. The first night in that house, no one slept. I woke up at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of footsteps, like wet shoes dragging across the attic. Jack blamed it on mice, but it didn't sound like that. It was steady, slow, and had a rhythm, almost like it was thinking. Natalie said a girl had been looking through her window, even though her room was on the second floor, with no balcony or any place to stand outside. Lucas spent the whole night muttering something about the woman with long hair standing in the wall. 3 days later, I found an old picture hidden behind the bookshelf. An old black and white photo, yellowed with age, showing a young girl standing on the front porch of the house. Her face was blurred, but her eyes were empty, chillingly so. I asked the nearest neighbor, Mrs. Lucy, a widow who lived about 3 houses down. She was silent for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. Her name was Madeline. She went missing. Well, no, they say she committed suicide. Hung herself in the attic, but no one ever saw the body. Just blood. A lot of blood. I shivered. Hung herself. And there was blood? I asked. Yeah. And there were these symbols. Strange symbols drawn in blood on the ceiling. The cops didn't dare go back the second time. The case was closed faster than you'd expect. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, just watching the wall clock tick by. Around 3 a.m., I heard Natalie screaming hysterically from her room. We rushed in and found her standing in the corner of the room, trembling, eyes wide open. On the glass of the window, misted with condensation, were small handprints. From the inside, no one had gone outside that night, and Lucas was still asleep. She whispered to me, Natalie cried. She said, "I'm tied in the wall. I can't rest." I began digging into the house's history. It wasn't easy, but after hours of scouring through the town archives, I found an old clipping from 1979. The body of young Madeline Rourke is believed to have been hanged in a bizarre ritual. Her family refused to publicly disclose details of the incident. The house was abandoned for 3 years before being sold. Another note at the end of the article made me gasp. According to neighbors, Madeline had said she was being followed by whispers behind the wall. She said the house had owners long before her, and they were not pleased to be disturbed. After that night, everything spiraled downhill quickly. Lucas began drawing pictures with black crayon, figures without faces, with ropes around their necks. Natalie refused to sleep alone. Jack started talking to himself, muttering nonsense like, "Don't go to the 3rd floor." Even though none of us had mentioned the 3rd floor, the attic had been locked for years. No key. But then, on a quiet, windless night, while I was reading in the living room, I heard a faint sound. Not footsteps, but tapping. 3 knocks. Slow. I stood up and traced the sound. It came from behind the hallway wall that led to the attic. A part of the wall had peeled away. When I touched it, the wood broke loose, revealing a narrow gap. There was something wedged inside. I pulled out an old journal. Its ink faded, but the first few pages were still readable. Day 14. I can't escape the dreams. Someone is watching me from the wall. I hear lullabies every night, and a voice whispers, "Become one of us." I don't want to, but I don't have much time left. I had never felt cold like that. Cold to the bone. That night, when I was about to call an exorcist, the phone rang 3 times and then hung up. When I checked the machine, there was no missed call, only a voicemail that lasted 8 seconds. In it, all I could hear was the tightening of a rope and a whisper, "You shouldn't have touched my journal. I thought I was stronger than this." But I was wrong. I had brought my whole family to a place that didn't belong to humans, and the walls were starting to stir. I couldn't sleep all night. I, who had never believed in the supernatural, now found myself trembling in fear of the dark. This house is not just a shelter. It's like a living creature. It breathes, it whispers, it watches, and with each passing day, it tightens its grip on us like decaying roots, creeping through our hearts and minds. I hid Madeline's journal in the drawer of the bedroom dresser. Jack still doesn't know about its existence. Lately, he has become distant. It's still the same face, the same voice, but Jack's eyes no longer seem to reflect me in them. The next morning, Lucas had a high fever. The boy mumbled in his delirium, his body soaked in cold sweat. I placed a cool cloth on his forehead, my hands trembling uncontrollably. But what chilled me to the core was not the fever, but the faint bruises around Lucas's neck, perfectly round and evenly spaced, as though something had choked him in the night. "Why do you have these marks, Lucas?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. The boy barely moved his lips. She didn't want me to scream. She told me I had to be quiet to hear her sing. I screamed for Jack, but when he entered, everything had vanished. The bruises, the strange smell, even the cold that had filled the room had suddenly disappeared. Jack looked at me as if I were delusional. "Did you even sleep last night?" I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. That afternoon, I decided to return to the attic. The door leading up there had been locked for a long time, with a rusty iron lock. None of us had a key. But when I tried the doorknob, the door opened. No sound, no lock. It just opened. A musty smell wafted up from the rotting wooden stairs, mixed with the scent of old ashes and something that smelled like burnt hair. I stepped up one stair at a time, each step echoing in the thick air. The attic was pitch black, but I could still see. Not with my eyes, but with some sixth sense that rose from my fear. In one corner, something was covered with a white cloth. I slowly pulled it back. A small wooden chair, its legs scratched as if dragged across the floor. On the chair, a frayed rope hung loosely, the knot at the end tied in a circle like a noose. But what made me want to collapse was the message written in black charcoal across the ceiling. "I am not the only one here." The sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned around. No one, but the door leading downstairs slammed shut. I ran to it, twisted the doorknob. Stuck, and then I heard it, a whisper right next to my ear, so soft it sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't be up here. You've already called them." I don't remember how I got downstairs. I only remember when Jack found me. I was crouched in the hallway, trembling, unable to speak. He took me to the room, made me a cup of hot tea, and said I was just stressed, that maybe I should visit my mother for a few days. I looked at Jack. I knew it was him, but I wasn't entirely sure anymore. Something was changing in him. That night, Natalie dreamt of Madeline again. She drew the dream in her little notebook. An empty room, bloodstains forming a circle on the floor, and in the center, a girl in a white dress. Her hair covering her face, her feet floating just above the ground. She said, "It's your turn, Mom," Natalie whispered. "Your turn for what, sweetie?" "Your turn to be hanged." I took Madeline's journal out to read again, this time from the last page. The scribbled writing seemed to be done in desperation. I hear voices, not one, but many. They whisper beneath the floor, on the walls, in the pillows. They say I'm the final part of the ritual. They need one more. And they chose me, just like they chose the others before me. I turned the last page. A small folded piece of paper, carefully tucked inside, had faded blue ink. "If anyone finds this, don't stay. This house is the mouth of something older than death. It needs blood, and it is hungry." I called Mrs. Lucy, the old neighbor. She was silent for a long time after I told her. "Have you been up to the attic?" she asked. "I had to find out what's happening. I told you not to stay in that house, but now it's too late. You know something, don't you? Madeline was murdered. It wasn't a suicide." Mrs. Lucy took a long breath. "Madeline was my granddaughter. Her mother lived in that house, and then went mad. She hanged herself in front of Madeline when she was only 5. Her father also disappeared without a trace. Some say he joined a cult, a blood ritual." I was speechless. The house, it used to be the meeting place for a group called the Third Purity Society. They believed souls had to be sacrificed to awaken the ancient master sleeping beneath the earth. Each generation, someone in the family must die by hanging. A blood loop. I looked up at the ceiling, right above the room I was in. Directly above me was the attic, the chair, the noose, where Madeline had once stood. And now, it might be my turn. There is type of fear that doesn't come from darkness or noises in the night. It comes from silence. The silence so long and absolute that you begin to hear your own heart constricting in your chest. Each beat like a hammer pounding in your ears. Every tick of the clock, every footstep in the hallway, every glance from a loved one, all become a threat. I'm living in that kind of silence. Jack is no longer Jack. Ever since I went up to the attic, something in his eyes changed. It became darker, emptier. In recent nights, I often catch him sitting in the middle of the living room, no lights, no sound, just staring at an invisible point on the wall. When I ask, he simply replies, "I'm listening." Listening to what, he doesn't say. But once, in his sleepwalking state, I heard him repeatedly mumbling, "We must complete the sacrifice. The blood must flow." I couldn't take it any longer. The next morning, when Jack took the kids to school, I went back to the bedroom, pulled out Madeline's diary again, and this time, I decided to do what I had been afraid of. Flip over the back cover. A small piece of leather was hidden inside, seemingly stained with dried blood on its edges. On it was a strange symbol, a spiral surrounding an open eye with an inscription below, written in an ancient script I didn't understand, but loosely translated with a blue ballpoint pen. The last one is the one who awakens. The last living one will open the gate. They need a family, a home, a blood death. I shuddered. Mrs. Lucy, the elderly neighbor, was the only person I thought of. I went to her house in the late afternoon as the rain was falling lightly and the sky was covered with gray clouds as though warning me. She greeted me with a sad look, as if she had been expecting me. Inside her house, there was no sound from the TV, radio, or any other noise except for the ticking of the grandfather clock, creaking with every beat. "I've read what Madeline left behind," I said directly. "You know the meaning of that ritual, don't you?" Mrs. Lucy remained silent, sipped her tea, and then said, "The Third Purity sect is not something people talk about in coffee shops. They are remnants of an ancient belief. The belief that human blood can awaken the ancient souls sealed away. Each home is a well, and if the ritual is performed for 3 generations, the keeper of the house will be summoned." "The keeper of the house? It's something beneath the earth. It has no name, but it lives on memory, pain, and betrayal. It needs a family. It needs a promise unkept." Her words made me choke. I thought of Madeline, of her mother, who had hanged herself in this very house. And now Jack, who was changing, whispering to something. My family is the 3rd generation to live in this house, the final piece. When I returned home, it was dark. Natalie was curled up in the corner of the living room. Lucas was pursing his lips, scribbling on the wall with red chalk, spirals and open eyes, exactly like the symbol on the leather. I snatched the chalk from his hands. "Lucas, who taught you to draw this?" He looked at me, his gaze distant. "Dad said we'll be together forever." I walked into the bedroom and saw Jack unpacking a suitcase. Inside, it wasn't clothes, but ropes, a small curved knife, a leather-bound book with no title, but I was certain it wasn't ours. He looked up calmly, as though I had just caught him getting ready for a camping trip. "I need to prepare," he said. "It's almost time." "Time for what?" I stepped back, my hand clutching the phone in my jacket pocket. "Time for the union. One death, one plea. We will live forever in this house, never to part again." I ran. I called the police, but when they arrived, Jack just smiled and said I was suffering from postpartum psychosis, delusions, and confusion. They found no knife, no ropes, no book. Jack put his arm around me gently. "She needs rest. She's too stressed." They left me there. I no longer trust the world outside. That night I hid in Natalie's room. I held her tightly and whispered that tomorrow I would take both of them away. But Natalie wasn't sleeping. She said, "She's sitting right in the wall, Mom. She says you can't escape. Only one person can end the ritual. But that person has to choose death." I trembled. "What are you talking about?" "She's Madeline. She was strict. She thought if she died, everything would end. But actually, she was just the beginning." I couldn't sleep. The knocking began again. 3 knocks from inside the wall. I pressed my ear to it. A cold breath exhaled. And then a female voice whispered, "You know what to do before he sacrifices your child." I returned to the attic. The chair was still there. The ropes had been replaced. A faint scent of incense hung in the air. A scent I'd never smelled anyone in the house burn before. On the wooden floor, a fresh blood circle was drawn, not yet dry. Footsteps led from the door to the chair, then disappeared into thin air. I knelt, crying. There was nowhere left to run. No one believed me. No way out. And then, in my ear, Madeline's voice echoed, "If one breaks the circle, if one willingly dies to protect, then the sacrifice circle will break. But they won't let you do that easily." I turned around and saw Jack standing at the last step. He smiled. In his hand was the black-handled knife. Jack stood there, at the last step leading to the attic. The dim light from the lamp casting his shadow long across the wooden floor like a pool of congealed blood. The knife in his hand glinted with a cold metallic shine, and for a moment I swore that those eyes were no longer those of the man I once loved, but two hollow pits, as though his soul had been pulled out and replaced with something older, darker. "You shouldn't resist it," Jack said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It has chosen you. You should feel honored." I stepped back, bumping into the old wooden chair where Madeline had once stood. The rope hung down, suspended just above my shoulder, like a mouth waiting for its next victim. "What are you talking about, Jack?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He stepped up one more step. "The Third Purification Society has failed for many years, but now all the pieces are in place. 3 generations, 1 roof, an unfinished ritual. You are the last, the awakening." I didn't wait for him to take another step. I turned and ran, down the stairs, my chest feeling like it would explode. In my mind, I saw Natalie and Lucas sleeping, completely unaware that death was creeping up behind them. I could hear Jack's footsteps behind me, steady, unhurried, as if he knew I couldn't run forever. I reached the kitchen, grabbed the bread knife, and tried to lock the door. Outside, Jack stood still. I heard nothing for a few seconds, until his voice rose from the other side of the door. "Do you know, the blood of the firstborn is what ends the sacrifice, or opens the gate completely. It depends on how the blood flows." I almost collapsed. Natalie. What was he going to do to Natalie? I pounded on the door, screaming, "If you touch the kids, I swear I'll—" Jack interrupted me with a dry, mocking laugh. "Don't you get it? I'm not me anymore. I couldn't hide forever." I squeezed through the kitchen window, running around to the back of the house, my feet crunching over brittle, dry leaves under the thin first snow. On the second floor, I saw Natalie's room light turn on. She was looking out the window, eyes wide open, her hand pressed against the glass. Behind Natalie was Jack. I didn't have time to think. I ran through the front door, crashing into furniture, then bolted up the stairs, shouting her name. When I burst into Natalie's room, Jack was standing next to the bed, knife in hand, and Natalie was crying silently, bound with a red rope like blood. A circle of blood symbols had been drawn around the bed, and the smell of incense was so thick I almost gagged. "You won't do this," I gasped. "Jack, can you hear me?" He turned to me, his head tilting slightly, as though trying to remember something distant. For a brief moment, just a fleeting moment, I saw his eyes blur, like a child lost in a dream. "I love you," he whispered softly. "Please run, before it takes control again." Then he screamed, slamming his head into the wall. A shriek echoed, not from Jack, but from the room. A high-pitched, shrill voice, like metal scraping glass. The wall behind Jack cracked open, and from the crack, blood began to seep out. Natalie passed out. I lunged forward, shoved Jack aside, grabbed the knife, and cut the ropes. He sprang to his feet, lunging at me, and we both fell to the floor. The blood from the crack in the wall starting to spill out in streams, forming swirling patterns. Jack tried to hold my hand, his voice gritting. "If you break the ritual, we all die. But if you let it end, it will grant you eternal life." I gathered all my strength and swung the knife's handle into his head. He collapsed. Blood oozed from his forehead. I scooped up Natalie and ran down. My mind only set on one thing: escaping this house. But Lucas was no longer in his room. I nearly stopped breathing. "Lucas!" I screamed, my voice hoarse, tearing through every corner. In the hallway downstairs, I saw the basement door wide open. And from below came a soft lullaby. "Sleep, don't fear. Mother has chosen for you." I stepped into the basement. Each step sank into an air thick with cold, as sharp as ice. The darkness down here wasn't natural. It was alive. It breathed. And it hated me. Lucas stood in the center of the basement, eyes shut, surrounded by red burn marks like they had been etched with blood. On the walls, crooked family portraits hung, and at the far end was an ancient wooden door sealed with chains. I stepped closer, hugging Lucas tightly, whispering constantly, "I'm here. I won't let anyone take you." Suddenly the door swung open. A rush of cold air spilled out, and from the darkness beyond the door, a tall, thin figure, elongated like it was stretched out, stepped forward. She wore a white dress, her face obscured by hair, with a rope tied around her neck. Madeline, but she was no longer the Madeline I had seen in dreams or paintings. She was the result of decades of pain, betrayal, and confinement. She was no longer the victim. She was the awakening. "You can't stop now," Madeline whispered. "The blood must flow, or all of you will be buried alive with me." I screamed, "You want justice, right? Then take me. Spare my children." She stepped closer, her cold hand brushing my cheek. In that moment, I saw her death, the blood ritual, the crying, the rope, and the cloaked figures calling the name of an unknown entity in the dark. I saw her eyes, and in them there was something strange. Regret. The basement began to collapse. The wall cracked open, earth and stone pouring down as though dug up from the very ground. I grabbed Lucas and ran back up the stairs. Behind me, Madeline's voice screamed in madness. Her voice blended into 1,000 other whispers. "The circle isn't complete. The circle isn't complete. The circle isn't complete." I bolted out of the house, Natalie on my back, Lucas in my arms. Right behind me, the front door slammed shut, and the house trembled as if it were taking its last breath. Windows shattered, the glass flying out like daggers. The roof collapsed, and then everything went silent. It was just me and the 2 kids, lying on the grass in front of the house, breathing heavily, alive. I don't remember how long I sat in front of that wild patch of grass, but I know that with each passing second, the beat of my heart slowed down, as if it was no longer sure that it was still alive. Natalie clung to my neck, her small body trembling from the cold. Lucas lay in my arms, his head resting on my chest, his breath weak but steady. The sky above slowly changed color, from a dark, gloomy black to a cold, ashen gray, as if even the sun hesitated to shine upon the place that used to be our home. The house was no longer there. It was just a pile of rubble where charred wood smoldered and smoke rose, and where bricks were thrown far out as if blasted by an explosion from within. No fire, no blood, but the smell of old damp flesh and human ash still lingered in the air. And no one left that place except us. The police arrived in the morning after I managed to call the emergency hotline for the first time. My voice shattered, sobbing in between meaningless words. When they arrived, they found no one else. No body of Jack, no basement, no sign of any rituals or the strange spiral markings once etched into the walls. only a house that collapsed due to weak foundations, as the investigation report later concluded. They didn't believe me. Of course not. Who would believe in voices from the walls, sacrificial rituals, or a soul sealed inside a house? I told them everything. About Madeline, about the journal, about the rituals. But when they returned to inspect the site, the journal had disappeared. I'm not even sure if I imagined it all, or if it wanted me to think that way. After 3 days in the hospital, I was diagnosed with psychological shock and post-traumatic stress. Natalie and Lucas weren't seriously injured, but they weren't fully awake yet. Natalie didn't say anything. She just kept drawing non-stop. They were all spirals, and a girl in a white dress standing in the middle of a room, faceless, holding her head as if in pain. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wooden basement door swinging open. I heard the soothing lullaby drifting from the crack in the wall. I saw Jack's eyes, not Jack anymore, looking at me as though I were the last witness to a crime the entire town had once conspired to bury. I decided to leave the town. There was nothing left to keep me there. The man I once loved was gone, and if he was still alive, I didn't want to know. Some mysteries, once awakened, would never rest again. I rented a small cabin in Maine, on the edge of the forest, an hour's drive from the nearest town. I wanted a place where no one knew me, no one could find me. A place where the wind could erase the memories and the forest could swallow the screams. I was wrong. The first week was strangely quiet. Natalie started laughing again. Lucas played outside as if nothing terrible had ever happened. I began writing in my journal, trying to capture every piece of memory as a reminder to myself that I wasn't crazy, that it really happened. But on the 8th night, I heard a knock. 3 knocks. Soft, steady, from behind the wardrobe in the bedroom. I froze. I couldn't breathe. The wind wasn't blowing. The windows were closed. Natalie and Lucas were sleeping. The knocking came again. I gathered all my courage, walked over, and pulled the wardrobe away from the wall. Nothing. Just peeling paint on the wall, cracks hidden in the dark corner. I turned on the flashlight, and my heart seemed to stop. A symbol, a spiral, drawn in. Something dark brown, maybe dirt, maybe blood. Under the symbol was a scribbled message. One has escaped, but the blood has not run dry. I screamed. Natalie shot up from her bed, and Lucas ran to hug my legs. I dragged them into the living room, locked all the doors, and trembled as I called 911. But there was no signal on the phone. It had been fine before. I grabbed an axe and ran out of the house, trying to find someone to help. In the forest, I found a small cabin that I initially thought was abandoned. But the lights were still on, and inside was an old man with silver hair, wearing a worn leather coat. He looked at me, not surprised. "I've been waiting for you," he said. I don't know who you are. I need help." He pointed to the table. On it was an old map and a leather-bound book, just like the one Jack had hidden in his suitcase. The symbol on the cover was the familiar spiral. "You've awakened it," he said. "And you thought it would die, just because the house collapsed?" I choked. "It's over. No, the house was just a vessel. What you call the housekeeper doesn't live in wood or brick. It lives in memories, in blood, in the survivors." I stepped back. "What are you talking about?" "Your firstborn. It's already marked." I returned in despair. clutching Natalie tightly. In her sleep, she whispered, "She's here, Mommy. She says I will take your place as the housekeeper." Story 5. The Deadly House. I've always believed there are places in this world that should never be touched. Lands forgotten by time and life, because death itself has chosen to remain there. It all began with a letter with no sender that Melissa, my girlfriend, found in the communal mailbox of our apartment complex in Denver, Colorado. There was no stamp, no postmark, just a pale yellow envelope, weathered with age, with her name written on the outside in slanted, shaky handwriting, as if it had been written by an unsteady hand. Curious, she opened it. Inside, there was a thin piece of paper and an old photograph of a 2-story wooden house in the woods. The only words written on the paper were, "This place needs to be remembered." I still clearly remember the way Melissa stood in silence for a long time, staring at the photo. It was as if she had been there before, though she swore she had never left Colorado for more than 3 days in her life. Just a week later, the 5 of us, me, Melissa, Jamie, Chris, and Natalie, 5 close friends from college, set off for that house. The house was located on the outskirts of a small town named Wetmore, near the Oregon-California border. It took us nearly 12 hours to drive there, through winding mountain roads covered in untrodden snow. The sky was a heavy gray, pressing down on the dense pine trees, and the wind wasn't blowing. It whispered. The house appeared suddenly after a sharp turn, like a silent observer that had stood there for decades. The roof was covered in green moss. The attic was leaning to one side, and the windows were sealed with old planks of wood. Yet the front door was slightly ajar. No one said anything. We just stood there in the car, looking out. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but I swear I heard something coming from inside, like the groan of wood or footsteps. Chris broke the silence with a weak joke. Guests were being welcomed. We brought our luggage inside, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The interior was mostly intact, though dust covered everything and the air smelled heavily of mildew. There was something very wrong. In the living room, Natalie discovered a large mirror covered with a white cloth. She pulled it down, revealing a mirror framed with intricate carvings of screaming faces. None of us dared to speak, but I knew. We all saw it. In the mirror, besides the 5 of us, there was a 6th shadow, standing in the corner of the room. The first night passed in the biting cold, with strange sounds coming from the basement. The scratching of metal, something breaking, and a faint laugh, fractured like glass being crushed. Melissa sleepwalked. I woke up in the middle of the night to find her standing in front of the mirror, eyes closed, whispering something in a strange language. When I touched her shoulder, she collapsed and didn't remember anything the next morning. Chris began seeing things no one else saw. He said there was an old man wearing a black hat, always standing outside his window at night. Jamie found a secret passage behind the fireplace that led down to the basement. He was determined to explore it, but when he came back, he couldn't remember what he had seen down there. He just kept repeating, "Someone was burned alive here." I started dreaming. Every night, I saw a family, a powerful father, a sad mother, and a child crying in the corner of the room. Then I saw other shadowy figures, holding axes, knives, lighters. I saw flames, blood splattering, and screams that left my throat raw when I woke up. On the fourth morning, Natalie disappeared. We searched everywhere: the basement, the attic, the woods surrounding the house. But there was no trace, no answer to our calls. In her room, on the bedspread, was a line written in blood. "It's not her fault, it's ours." Melissa began to remember. She said she had been here as a child with her mother, but her mother had never mentioned that trip again. When she called home to ask, her mother stayed silent for a long time, then only said, "You mustn't be there. That house is part of our family's tragedy. You must leave immediately." We tried to leave, but as we drove down the forest trail, we found ourselves back at the house, despite having driven nearly an hour in the opposite direction. That night, Jamie was no longer himself. He quietly took a lighter, burned the mirror, then turned to look at us and whispered in a child's voice, "Now you'll know what it feels like to be burned alive." The fire blazed fiercely, but strangely, it didn't spread to anything else. Only the mirror burned to ashes, and from the pile of soot, a small iron frame was revealed, like a small door. Inside was an old VHS tape with faded lettering. "The Last Night, 1974. When we played the tape, the screen showed images of the very same house, but newer, brighter. A family was having dinner. Then a knock at the door. A man entered. His face was hidden behind a white mask. The massacre began. Blood, screams, crying. A child hiding under the table, trembling. And then he looked straight at the camera, straight at us. I used to think I was rational, a skeptic of the supernatural, always needing proof and logic. But after that night, after the VHS tape, and the unflinching gaze from the child on the screen, everything inside me began to crack. It was like a mask being slowly peeled away, revealing something unfamiliar, ancient, and terrifying. None of us slept. Jamie kept his head down by the fireplace, the flickering light distorting his face, making him look like an old puppet. Melissa started sleepwalking again. This time, she walked straight down to the basement and stood motionless in front of a stone wall covered in moss. When Chris pulled her away, bloody handprints were clearly visible on the wall. No one spoke, but I knew. We all felt it. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The next morning, it rained heavily. The radio signals and phone reception were completely gone. We were cut off from the outside world. Natalie still hadn't returned. But strangely, her clothes appeared back in the room, neatly folded on the bed, as if she had never left. A foul smell rose, like a mixture of decay, mold, and burning metal. The ladder leading down was dark, rusted, and icy cold. I counted each step as I descended. 7, 8, 9. On the 13th step, I heard breathing. Not from anyone in our group. A narrow hallway stretched out before me, my flashlight flickering despite the batteries being full. The walls were thick with scratch marks and dried blood writings. "Do not betray blood." We swore. "The one who returns will die again." I tried to ignore it, but Jamie suddenly stopped. He pointed at a wall where black wooden frames were hanging. I stepped closer. In one frame, there was a picture of me, with Melissa standing beside me. The photo was black and white, like it was taken decades ago, but the faces and clothing were exactly as they were now. It couldn't be. Under the photo was a name: Eleanor Whitmore and William K. Hyde. Melissa saw it, immediately panicked, stepping back as though someone had slapped her face. She trembled, whispering, "Eleanor is my mother's name. But William is my great-grandfather, who died in the fire of 1974. That fire happened in this house." The air grew thick. I felt as if a cold hand had been placed on my shoulder. We rushed out of the basement, but when we climbed back up, the iron door slammed shut. No matter how hard we knocked, it wouldn't open. Darkness swallowed us again. When the light suddenly turned on, not our flashlight, but the overhead light, a completely different room appeared. Wooden chairs were arranged in a circle, with a round table covered in a white cloth in the middle. On the table was a thick, old book with a black cover embossed with an inverted star symbol. A family ledger. Melissa shakily flipped through the pages. The names stretched through generations. Whitmore, Hyde, Kessel. Then, at the very last entry, Melissa Eleanor Hyde, born in 1998, the final heir. I whispered, almost not recognizing my own voice. "You're connected to this house. Your family lived here." She broke into tears. My mother never told me. I only knew my great-grandfather died in a fire. But now, I feel like I remember. Things I shouldn't remember. The light went out. This time it was pure darkness. A voice echoed, raspy, distorted, as if coming from a severed throat. "You have returned. Complete the ritual. Remember the oath of blood." Jamie screamed, and his flashlight flickered back on. But now, only 4 of us remained. Chris had disappeared. Instead, in the center of the circle of chairs, was an item. Chris's jacket covered in ash, and underneath, small white bones, tied together with a red thread. We crawled up, scrambling up the ladder, banging on the door desperately. Suddenly the door opened. But it didn't lead to the kitchen. It led to another room, a child's room. The walls were painted light green. On the bed were old stuffed animals, and on the desk, a diary. I shakily opened it. The childish handwriting was crooked, but the contents sent a chill down my spine. Mom said if I kept the secret, he would let me live. But he lied. I heard the screaming. I saw the blood. I ran. But the mirror wouldn't cover it forever. I'm scared. If anyone reads this, don't trust the house. Don't trust the mirror. And don't trust the one who came with you. I looked up at Jamie, at Melissa. Then I started to realize something very strange in Melissa's eyes. It was like it wasn't her anymore. I began to suspect Melissa on the 6th night. Not because she changed suddenly, but because the change was so subtle, so skillful, as if she was still Melissa, but no longer belonged to this place. She no longer showed fear. She wasn't startled by strange noises in the walls. No more sleepwalking. She moved around the house as if she were the former owner returning after a long absence, knowing exactly which door led where, which floor had a crack in the wall, and when they would return. The way she referred to the entities in the house made my spine chill. Ever since Chris disappeared, the house seemed to have shifted into another cycle. There was no longer any distinction between day and night. Sometimes we saw the sun rise outside the window, but only moments later, darkness would fall. At times, the clock showed 3 a.m., yet the sound of cicadas buzzed as if it were the peak of summer noon. Jimmy began to lose control. He sat by the living room window, his eyes fixed on the distant forest, where a slender figure stood motionless for hours. "That's Natalie," he whispered. "She's waiting for me, but she won't step inside because she has no legs anymore." I knew it was crazy, but instinctively, I believed him. One morning, I woke up and found Melissa standing in the second floor library, a room we had never dared to enter because the thick wooden door was always locked. But today, it was wide open. She stood in front of a large bookshelf, holding a dark brown leather-bound notebook, looking at me with an unusually calm expression. She said, "Will, you need to know the truth. We're not the first ones here." I froze. "What do you mean?" "Your name is William. I'm Eleanor. We lived here 50 years ago. We were killed in this very house." I laughed, a defensive reaction. "Melissa? I'm Will." "William, really? But you're Melissa, my girlfriend. We've never lived here. We're just being haunted by something." "No, Will," she whispered, moving closer to me. "You've forgotten. The house won't let you remember. But I do. And that's why I'm back." Her words haunted me all day. Back. What did that mean? Why could only she remember? And what about me? Jamie, Chris, Natalie. Who were we really in this twisted game? That night, I dreamed. Not a normal dream, but the memories of someone else. I saw myself, younger, wearing a classic brown suit, sitting in an armchair in front of the fireplace with a woman who had long black hair, like Melissa, but not her. She was crying, whispering to me, "We can't trust them. Blood won't save the soul." Then the door burst open. Relatives, siblings, family, people who had come to my house weekly, rushed in with knives and axes. I screamed, shielding her, but everything went dark. When I woke up, I realized I had screamed in the middle of the night. Cold sweat soaking my pillow. Jamie whispered by the bed, "Will?" I remember. I used to be the one who lit the fire. In the morning, I went downstairs and found Melissa boiling water. She said softly, "You need to see the attic." We had never been up there. The stairs leading up were covered with a heavy curtain, and every time we got close, the lights would go out and the floor would seem to shake. Not this time. Melissa and I stepped up each creaky step, the wood groaning beneath our feet like the sound of bones breaking. The attic door opened, revealing a dusty room, but at the center was a stone table. On the table were 3 items: a silver dagger, a black and white photo of me and Melissa, and a small vial filled with thick red liquid. "You were killed here," Melissa said, her voice hollow, "by the person you trusted the most. That person was me." I stepped back. No, I didn't want to do it. But the Hyde bloodline requires a sacrifice. To keep the soul here, to protect the family secret. I did it, but then I died too. The house doesn't let anyone escape. I screamed and knocked the stone table over. The photo fell to the floor, shattering. At that moment, Jamie rushed up from the stairs, his eyes glazed. "Will, we don't have much time," he said. "I've opened the last door. What's sleeping in the basement is about to wake up." We followed Jamie down to the ground floor. He led us to a room we had never seen. The door behind the library wall now visible, as if it had always been there. The room was empty, except for a painting on the wall. The painting depicted a family banquet, where all the faces were blackened with charcoal. Below the painting was a small hole. Jamie crawled inside first. We followed him, leading to a deep basement where there was a massive stone wall with hundreds of names carved by hand. The last name was mine. William K. Hyde, 1925. I touched my name. The wall trembled slightly. A crack opened, and from inside came the sound of breathing. Melissa stepped back, tears falling. "You have to do the last thing," I asked. "What is it?" She handed the silver dagger to me. "Stab me. My blood will seal it." I broke the rules when I came back. I don't deserve to be saved. I shook my head, not believing it. But Jamie whispered softly, "If you don't do it, all of us will be trapped forever, like the others in the wall." I trembled, standing there, holding the dagger, looking at the girl I loved, or once loved, or perhaps never truly knew. I closed my eyes. Then I stabbed. The wind howled in the stone basement like the cries of hundreds of souls. The blood dripped onto the floor, dark red. Cold, Melissa smiled and said her final words. "Thank you for remembering." When the knife plunged deep into Melissa's chest, I felt time freeze in that moment. There was no rush of blood, no agonizing screams like I had expected. Just a long breath exhaled from her lips, light as the wind whispering through the autumn trees. She looked at me, her eyes no longer reflecting life, but rather like a mirror containing centuries of deathly memories. "You don't belong here anymore." That final sentence, when it echoed, was no longer Melissa's voice. It was Eleanor's. The woman from the dreams, from the tape, from the decaying history of the house. Then her body slowly disintegrated into dust right before my eyes. No one should ever have to witness that. No one should have to hold a knife to kill the one they love, to save themselves from a house that had long ceased being a home, but had become a living entity. Jamie stood frozen, his lips moving, but no words coming out. I saw something shattered in his eyes. Perhaps it was the last sliver of sanity. Perhaps it was the will to survive. In the stone basement, after Melissa vanished, the wall with the names began to tremble violently. The carved names seemed to be dragged, scraped, distorted, until only one name remained intact. William K. Hyde, 2025, me. That's when I realized the ritual wasn't over. Melissa wasn't the only one who needed to die. We tried to run out of the basement, but the old path was gone. The hallway had disappeared. Instead, there was a spiral staircase of stone leading deeper into the earth. The air grew thicker, heavy with the stench of rotting flesh and ash. The walls on both sides were no longer just stone, but human arms, hundreds, thousands, emerging from the surface as if frozen in the agonizing throes of death. One hand grabbed Jamie. He screamed, struggling, but then a second hand, then a third, reached out to hold him fast. I turned back, pulling at his hand. But then I heard a voice, echoing from deep within the stairs. "He is the fire, and you are the end." Jamie screamed, "Will, run! I'm the one who started the fire. I opened the loop. You're the one who must close it." I let go of his hand. Not because I wanted to, but because Jamie pushed me away. His face lit up one last time. Not with fear, but with relief. Then he was dragged down. His limbs, his face vanished into the stone wall, as though melting into living cement. The staircase suddenly stopped. Before me was a black wooden door, old, cracked, and breathing. I opened the door. It wasn't a crypt, it wasn't a basement, but a cozy, old-fashioned living room. The furniture was elegant, a fireplace, warm and inviting, the walls adorned with family portraits. Smiling faces, holding wine, dancing around the banquet table. I stepped back. Everything looked too alive. Suddenly a sound came from the corner of the room. An old tape player clicked on by itself. The screen opened, and I saw myself walking into this room. The screen showed me looking around startled, stepping back as if reviewing something I had just done. But I had never been here before. Had I? Will. I spun around. That voice. Melissa. She stood in the middle of the room, as vivid as if I had never killed her. It can't be, I whispered. She walked up to me, placing a hand on my chest. Don't you understand? We can never leave here because we are part of it. I stepped back, hitting the wall. But it wasn't a wall anymore. It was a mirror. In the mirror was another living room. The same shape, but older, more dilapidated. On the floor were the blackened corpses of people, with fire still smoldering beneath the chairs. I turned to look at the real room. It was still intact, bright. Then I looked at myself in the mirror. He didn't move like I did. He didn't mimic my actions. He smiled and slowly walked toward the other side of the mirror. I turned and ran, but the door disappeared. There was no way out. The room closed in around me. The ceiling pressed down. A voice echoed. One soul enters, one soul leaves. The loop must continue. I fell to my knees, clutching my head. In that moment, everything came rushing back. Suddenly, brutally. I had lived here. I had died here. And I had returned. Not just once, but countless times. Each time with a different name, with a different face. But I always came back. And always had to choose. Kill or be killed. I stood up, charging toward the mirror. But this time, I didn't break it. I stepped into it. And in an instant, as I passed through the glass, the house disappeared. I opened my eyes. I was sitting on a bed. The morning light streamed through the window. I was in a small apartment in Denver. My apartment. No Jamie, no Melissa, no deathly house. Just a dream. Right? I jumped up and ran to the bathroom mirror. I looked into it. Dark circles under my eyes. My heart pounding. I exhaled deeply, trying to calm myself. And then I saw the photo, stuck to the mirror with a piece of old tape. A black and white photo of a 2-story wooden house in the woods. The words on the back of the photo, written in shaky, slanted handwriting. This place needs to be remembered. Story 6. The building with no escape. The building where I was taking shelter was no longer a safe place. The solid concrete walls, once symbols of strength and protection, now felt like a prison tightening around me. In the past few days, after the natural disaster struck, I and a group of survivors had found refuge in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The terrifying storm had destroyed everything, severed all communication, and rendered all means of transportation useless. But none of us had expected this place to become a prison. A place where we would face something far more horrifying. Fear and unease loomed over us. The atmosphere was grim and heavy. People didn't talk much. Just furtive glances, hurried footsteps, and eyes filled with silent dread. But what I couldn't bear was the sound, the whispers. At first they were vague, strange, and barely noticeable. But gradually they became clearer, soft yet suffocating, as if trying to seep through the cracks in the walls. I still remember the first day. I sat alone in my room, trying to escape the overwhelming panic that thickened the air. Only the sound of rain tapping on the window and the silence of the other survivors kept me company. But then, I heard a faint whisper from outside the room. Help. Help. At first I thought it was the wind or some ordinary noise, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was no ordinary sound. That voice did not belong to any of us. It was cold and echoing, as if it came from a place far, far away. I didn't tell anyone about the whisper. We were already suffering enough from everything going on. But that night, when everyone had fallen asleep, the whisper returned, clearer than ever. Help. Us. Help, please. I got up, stepped out of my room, and looked down the pitch-black hallway. The entire building was swallowed by darkness, with only the sound of slow footsteps echoing between the rooms. I moved toward the window, hoping to see something different outside. But when I opened it, the world outside wasn't what I had imagined. There was no rain, no wind, only an eerie, deafening silence. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. Something was watching me from the darkness. And then I realized the whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the building. Help! Help! This time the whisper was closer, like it was standing right behind me. I turned around, but all I saw was darkness. The building remained still and silent, except for me, standing there amidst a suffocating void. Then I heard another sound like someone dragging heavy feet across the floor. I couldn't stay still anymore. My footsteps echoed through the hallway as I ran, frantically looking for the others. But all I found were locked doors. No one answered when I knocked. It was then that I realized something horrifying. The survivors around me, they weren't who I thought they were. Someone or something had changed them. Their eyes had grown dull, like they weren't fully alive anymore. And then I discovered that the whispers weren't pleas for help. They were a curse. By midnight, unable to bear it any longer, I decided to confront one of the survivors. I sought out James, a man with a hardened appearance who rarely spoke and always seemed lost in thought. I began to tell him about the whispers I'd been hearing, but he only shook his head. That's just a hallucination. We've all been under too much stress, running on no sleep. Don't let it get to you, James said, trying to reassure me. But I didn't believe him. I had heard them. I knew it wasn't just in my head. And then, when I returned to my room, I noticed something strange. Everything in my room had changed. The paintings on the walls were no longer normal. They began to move, as if they had a life of their own. The paintings, the statues, even the objects in the room, everything felt like it was staring right at me. That's when I realized those spirits I had heard were not merely echoes of the dead. They were the souls of people who had died in the disaster. But they had no intention of resting in peace, and if I didn't do what they wanted, I would become one of them, trapped in this endless darkness forever. Can I escape this place? Or will these spirits make me a part of their twisted game? One thing I know for sure, I can't go on like this any longer. The entire building was engulfed in darkness, like a giant beast swallowing everything. Not just the light, but life itself. When I returned to my room that night, the fear hadn't let me go. The whispers from the night before still echoed in my head like a persistent sound I couldn't shake off. I tried to close my eyes and sleep, but I knew rest wouldn't bring peace. The spirits, the ghosts, they were still lurking somewhere in this house. Story 7. Voices of Despair from the Basement. The Lambert family moved into their new home on a drizzly afternoon in the middle of autumn. It was an old house in the outskirts of Salem, a small town in Massachusetts, where quiet streets and aged houses evoked a nostalgic sense of time. Looking at the house, no one could imagine what would unfold afterward. Despite its peaceful appearance, the house concealed a dark shadow that no one wished to confront. Sophie, the mother, was the first to sense something strange. She stood on the second floor, gazing down into the spacious living room. The white grey walls, faded by time, and the dim light from an old chandelier shone onto the peeling wooden stairs. Despite this, the house had an enigmatic beauty, an allure Sophie couldn't explain. She felt as though the house was waiting for something, as if it was trying to convey a message. It must just be because I'm tired, Sophie told herself, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. She turned back to look at her husband, Ethan, who was hauling boxes in and out. She called up to the third floor, where their children, Jason and Lily, were busy organizing their toys. That evening, as night fell, a cold chill swept over the house. Sophie had prepared dinner, and the family gathered to eat. The atmosphere felt heavy, indescribable. Sophie tried to push away the feeling, but the harder she tried, the stronger it became. Suddenly, a cry for help echoed from the basement. Sophie jumped, placing her fork down on the table. She looked at Ethan with a panicked expression. "Did you hear that?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stopped eating, his expression serious. "Yes, I heard it too, but it's probably just the wind. Maybe the basement door is stuck." But it wasn't the wind. Sophie could feel it. The fear spread through the air. The cry for help sounded again, this time clearer, more desperate, as if someone was pleading for help. Each word, each sound made Sophie unable to sit still. "I'll go check," Ethan said, standing up and pulling a flashlight from the drawer. Sophie and Ethan carefully descended the wooden stairs. Each step creaked under their feet as if the house was warning them. At the basement door, Ethan turned the old doorknob. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air hit their faces. The light from Ethan's flashlight illuminated only a small portion of the dark basement. They stepped inside, looking around. There was no one there. The room was filled only with rotting wooden planks and piles of old discarded things. But the cold was so intense that it felt as though their skin could no longer sense warmth. An eerie silence enveloped them. "It's probably just the wind, Sophie," Ethan said, trying to reassure his wife. "There's no one here." But Sophie couldn't shake the fear. She felt that something was wrong. An eerie sense of familiarity, as if she had encountered this before. An invisible dread. The next night, the cries for help returned. This time, not only Sophie but also Jason and Lily heard them. The screams were full of pain and despair. The Lambert family, unable to bear it, went down to the basement once more. And this time, they saw something different. In the darkness, strange images appeared, shadowy figures drifting across the walls, grotesque faces staring at them, sometimes hands reaching out from the walls. Jason screamed when he saw a hand suddenly reach out and touch his shoulder. The boy trembled, eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The strange images kept appearing, as if the house had some power that was pulling them in. Sophie and Ethan tried to stay calm, but they couldn't. The whole family couldn't sleep for the next several nights. Every night, they faced the cries for help, the vague images, and the strange ghosts. It seemed as if the house wouldn't let them rest. Finally, one night, Sophie decided she had to uncover the truth about the house. She searched through old town records and found a chilling story. The house had once belonged to a man named Henry Ward, who had lived there for many years. According to old records, Henry Ward was suspected to be a murderer. He had killed a group of people and locked them in the basement, preventing them from passing on. Sophie felt she could hardly breathe when she discovered this truth. The restless souls were still lingering around the house waiting to be freed. But perhaps those souls were trying to warn the Lambert family of something worse that was waiting for them. Sophie couldn't forget the feeling after reading the old records about the house. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed, and fur surged like waves crashing endlessly. Henry Ward, the man they had heard about in stories that the locals still whispered about, was not just an ordinary murderer. He didn't just kill people. He locked his victims in the basement of this house, letting them die slowly in the darkness. There were no corpses, only souls trapped, unable to move on. They were still lingering in the house, suffering, desperate. And now, they were seeking revenge. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, the cries for help echoed again, this time louder, as if they were coming from the very heart of the house itself. She dared not get up, dared not go down to the basement again. But curiosity, fear, and the feeling that something was wrong kept her awake. She looked out the window, seeing only a thick darkness, like a black cloak covering the entire house. The deeper the night went, the colder the feeling became, as if the house was draining the last bit of warmth from her. When the dim light from the night lamp was enough for her to see the dancing shadows on the wall, Sophie heard the cries for help once more. But this time, the cries seemed to come from deeper within, from her very soul. They were painful, terrifying, full of despair. Suddenly, a chilling sensation ran down her spine. She felt a cold hand reaching out, as if someone was trying to touch her from behind. But when she turned, there was nothing. It was just the darkness, the fear, and the suffocating air. Sophie could no longer bear it. She silently got out of bed, determined to face the truth. She couldn't continue living in this house without knowing what was really happening. Sophie descended the stairs, step by step, each stair creaking strangely, as if someone was following her, listening to her every step. At the basement door, Sophie stood still before the old door, feeling a cold draft coming from within. She grabbed the doorknob, took a deep breath, and opened it. The basement was different this time. Indeed, no one was there, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if time had stopped. The room felt trapped in an invisible space, and Sophie could feel the presence of souls staring at her. She stepped in, the flashlight in her hand, the only light in the pitch dark. The light illuminated the old wooden planks and piles of discarded belongings. An eerie silence enveloped the space, and then, suddenly, blurry figures began to appear. They slowly formed before Sophie's eyes, distorted, agonized faces, the shapes of those who had died in the basement. She stepped back, her heart pounding, but she couldn't turn away. Each time Sophie looked into those faces, she felt something deeper. These souls didn't just want her to see them. They needed help. They needed to be freed, but Sophie didn't know how. She took a deep breath and began muttering prayers. But nothing changed. The figures grew clearer, their eyes becoming deep, as if they could see right through her. A dry, cold hand reached out from one of the figures and touched Sophie's shoulder. She screamed, but no sound escaped her throat. only a terrifying silence. She turned her head and saw Henry Ward, the man who had killed these souls. For a moment, he stood there, right in front of her, with a cold stare and a strange smile. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice echoing in the dark space, as if it was coming from the very walls filled with torment. Sophie couldn't move. A paralyzing sensation took over her body. "We will never move on. We will be here forever, in this darkness, and no one can save us." Henry Ward continued, and his laughter reverberated through the room. But then, something strange happened. A powerful light pierced the darkness, causing Henry Ward and the shadowy figures to begin fading. They didn't disappear entirely, but they no longer held Sophie. She ran out of the basement, her heart racing wildly in her chest. When she reached the upper floor, she looked back one last time at the basement. The light from the flashlight still illuminated the deep shadows, but there were no figures anymore. She didn't understand what had just happened, but one thing was certain. This house was no ordinary house. These souls couldn't free themselves, and those ghosts would continue to haunt Sophie's family until they found a way to break the painful cycle. Sophie returned to her room and sat still, clutching the necklace she always wore. She knew she couldn't escape this house, but she also knew that she had to find a way to save her family from the souls trapped in this darkness. The curse of the house had not ended. After that night, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the basement. She no longer felt peaceful in this house, and the feeling of being haunted, being watched, became more and more palpable. The basement was not the only place in the house that held mysteries. The entire house seemed to be covered by a dark, ominous veil. As if all the events of the past refused to be revealed, Sophie began to dig deeper into the history of the house, not only through old documents, but also through the stories that people in the town frequently passed down. Late at night, when everyone had fallen asleep, she quietly sifted through books, letters, and yellowed scraps of paper. In her old notebook, Sophie found a photograph of the house, taken from an angle she had never seen before. In the photo, a small door leading to the basement stood wide open, and inside, a shadowy figure stood motionless. The person's face was blurry, indistinct, but their eyes seemed to pierce through Sophie. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized that something was terribly wrong with the house's history. Sophie believed the spirits didn't just want revenge. They weren't ordinary spirits. They were trapped here, held captive by some force stronger than life and death itself. But Sophie couldn't do anything. She couldn't just sit and wait. She needed to learn more about the people who had once lived in this house. She decided to visit the town library the next morning, hoping to find more information. At the library, Sophie found a book titled The Souls Unreleased, The Mysterious Cases in the History of Salem. When she flipped through the pages, she found a chapter dedicated to their house. The book told the story of Henry Ward, but it didn't just stop at calling him a murderer. The real story was that after killing a group of people, Henry had used an ancient ritual to trap their souls in this house. He believed that only when the souls of his victims were completely imprisoned would he be able to maintain his own immortality. It wasn't just Henry. Other souls were also tied to this house. They couldn't move on for a very strange reason. Each soul, before dying, had a loved one who was sacrificed alongside them. They couldn't leave without freeing those they had lost. Sophie felt dizzy when she read this part. She realized that this wasn't just a simple murder. It was a curse, a cycle of death and suffering where the souls were bound and unable to escape this world. She felt as though she was trapped in an irreversible disaster, yet she couldn't stop. When she returned to the house, the tension was palpable. The cries for help had gradually become more haunting. Every night, they didn't just come from the basement, but from everywhere in the house. Faint images began appearing before her eyes, shadows that floated around the dark corners. Sophie felt as if they weren't just staring at her, but were trying to say something. She couldn't stand still. She decided to learn more about the ritual that Henry Ward had performed. If there was a way to free these spirits, she had to find it. One night, when it was late and the whole family was asleep, Sophie went back down to the basement, but this time, she brought an ancient book she had found at the library. Inside, it contained instructions on how to break the curse that Henry Ward had created. The basement door creaked open, and a cold air rushed in. Sophie felt a strange heaviness in the space, as though the house was gradually pulling her into its darkness. She stepped in, holding the book tightly in her hands. Her eyes sparkled with determination, but inside, she was a mess. She knew she was facing something that couldn't be explained by reason. Every step she took felt like a challenge, like an invitation to the restless souls. Halfway into the basement, Sophie stopped. Shadowy figures began to appear, slowly taking shape, their eyes filled with hatred and pain. Sophie knew that these spirits weren't enemies. They were victims of some dark force. Sophie opened the book, searching for the curse, but as soon as she began reading the words, the house seemed to react. The basement door slammed shut, and a bone-chilling gust of air hit her. Sophie felt as though she couldn't breathe, but she didn't give up. She kept reading, with a strange belief that if she followed the steps correctly, the souls would be freed. When she reached the last line, a sound like tearing space itself echoed. The shadowy figures around Sophie screamed in agony. Everything around her began to turn into darkness. She saw hands reaching out from the walls, from the floor. But they weren't Henry Ward's hands. They were the hands of the victims, the ones who had died in pain and despair. Suddenly, Sophie felt a shift in the air. The spirits began to emit a soft glow, and the cries for help stopped. She didn't know if she had succeeded, but she could feel something strange in the air. A quietness, an ending. As she walked out of the basement, the house's light seemed warmer, and for the first time in many nights, Sophie felt like she could breathe. But she also knew this story wasn't over. The spirits hadn't completely vanished, and there were probably many more secrets she hadn't uncovered. She couldn't forget those eyes,